Boom. What up, guys? We are live. So we got NotSoErudite joining us, known as Kyla, right? Or Kyra?
Kyla. Yeah.
Kyla, cool. Yeah, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for you invited me, so I appreciate you kind of reaching out and inviting me on. I'm curious, how did you said that your viewers, but I was checking your channel today, and I know that you talked to Destiny, and you saw this conversation with Abba. So I'm wondering if that's also how you know me, because I think me, Destiny, and Abba were talking at first, and then those two continued talking. I'm not sure if you saw that stream where we all talked, but
I watched some of your streams today. It was purely from the comments. People reached out. Now, I'll be honest.
Okay.
I was doing a good amount of research on you today, too. I think we're going to agree way more than we disagree. I think people thought we'd have a lot of disagreements. I think we'll have maybe a few, but I think there's probably going to be more agreements. Like, I was watching your video on Fresh and Fit where you were criticizing them.
Yeah.
I pretty much agree with all your points.
Cool. And maybe good then to just talk and see. I have so many thoughts on dating and stuff. It's an area where I'm really, really interested in, and I think I'm more sympathetic to men's issues than a lot of women who talk about dating. So that's probably part of where people get thrown by me, is they'll often see me as a woman who's definitely outspoken and be like, oh, she must be pretty like blue-pilled on dating.
Yeah,
and I'm not. So
yeah, that's the vibe I got. Plus, I also heard that your husband was into pickup, right?
Yeah. He actually utilized pickup a fair bit. So he took like certain skills. But this is where we may differ, is like we definitely approach dating from a different like ethics and like viewpoint than some pickup artists. I don't know specifically your viewpoint on all this stuff, so I'm gonna not assume, but yeah, he definitely used pickup artists to hone certain soft skills like cold approach and stuff.
Cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, the one thing I did disagree with his characterization on, I was watching the stream where you guys were doing together, was he was saying that in his opinion, most of the pickup artists hate women or whatever. And I got to push back against that. I think it's only a small percentage. I would, if I had to put a number on it, I would say it's like less than 10%. And I've been involved in the pickup community for like a decade.
I think it depends on what we mean by hate women. So I wouldn't say that most of them like objectively hate women in like a very vitriolic incel-y way. Whereas incels, when you talk to them, they really do kind of hate women. And when you hear them talk about women, there's this like intense vitriol. Whereas a lot of pickup artists, when I hear them talk about women, it's in a more, I guess, I view something like sexism and misogyny different. Misogyny would be like a hatred of women, whereas sexism is just kind of like viewing women as a little bit lesser. And I think like most pickup artists engage in some level of sexism, but I'm going to be clear, I think almost everyone does to some extent. I just think we've got a problem on the left where we've made, if you like use the word sexism at all, it's just like you're a horrible, evil person who can never be redeemed. It's like, hold up, pretty much everyone has biases and stuff. Like that's not the end of the world. It's just noticing it and not like acting into it.
So, okay, so let me kind of figure out your position a little bit more. So if like, okay, so like if someone like me and I was saying like, oh, I think men are typically on average make better leaders, but doesn't mean women aren't capable of leadership. Just think on average that tends to work out. Would that be considered like thinking women are lesser? Or it's more like, I think as a person, women are just a little bit more inferior? Like which one of those categories is it?
It would be the latter. So a better way to talk about sexism, I think the way most people have any level of like sexism, and to be clear, I also engage in a little bit of sexism. Like to me, sexism isn't a big spooky word. It's just like a realization of a bit of a bias that I think is really culturally infused. And so there's an issue in that I'm a bit esoteric about my own language. But when I'm talking about sexism, I'm thinking about the fact that there are traits that I would assign to both genders that are different. The problem is that I think the traits that we assign to masculinity more often is a little bit more valued than the traits we assign to femininity. And therefore, if somebody's like engaging in a lot of more feminine behaviors and stuff, we tend to not value that as much and like respect it. Whereas we respect a lot of more like traditionally masculine traits. And so in that way, there's a bit of sexism in that, like, just because like, for example, women might not be more inclined to leadership because they tend to be like a lot less aggressive and therefore it's more difficult to be assertive. They bring other things to tables that I think are oftentimes undervalued. Like women are typically like way more empathetic and kind and nurturing and very much for social glue. But at a business level and a societal level, we don't really look at the social glue factor and see like an inherent value to that. We kind of often just think about like leaders and stuff like that. And I don't think we like would respect somebody as much as being like, if I say somebody's a social glue to their group, their fabric, we're going to be like, that's cool. But if I say somebody's an excellent leader, we're gonna be like, oh, wow. Like, right. There's just a difference in how I think we at an emotional level interact with it.
But so would that fall under the sexism category? Because I feel like okay. But then I feel like by that, we would all, like, everyone's a sexist then, right?
Yeah,
like
I think our culture is like softly sexist. I just think the fact that we make sexism like a big ooga booga is the problem. I think it's inherent, and I think our society would be improved by valuing femme traits a lot more, because I think there's a lot of things like in mental health and stuff like that, including men's mental health, that could be improved if we came as a society to value things like social cohesion a little bit more. But yeah, if everyone has a little bit of this, it's not about like you're a big bad ooga booga. It's we all have this a little bit, and we should probably as a society work on this and maybe not target a single individual unless they're being like flagrantly sexist, like just being like women suck, they're terrible at things, and they just cannot do things, right? If you say women cannot do certain things, they'll be like, well, why? What's your reasoning? And if your reasoning is like, well, they're just like less capable in all ways, I'd be like, that's probably not true, and that's a little sexist. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the way I've always defined sexism, is like when you think like as intrinsically valuable into like the world, a woman is less than like a man, right? That's sexism. But like, I don't even know, like, okay, so let's assume as a society we do decide to work on that. There's still like, you're not for like genderless type of, I don't know.
I'm not a gender abolitionist, no.
Okay. All right. Just making sure. Because I feel like how do you like, because there are certain things that men are going to be better at, and there's certain things that women are going to be better at. Like women typically make, a lot better HR, right? Like, because they're much better at social things. Men typically would make better, I don't know, like, let's say like engineers, right? Men typically more go into STEM fields. So it's like you can like make incentives, like you can give like women a some kind of incentive to enter a certain field, like maybe make it a little easier or something like that. But you're still not going to get rid of the discrepancy. So how do you even work on that as a society?
That's a really big question. So I'll hedge my response in this by saying I am not going to even begin to pretend like I have all the answers to solve society. And I think people who do respond as like, this is just what society needs to do, are typically very naive. So I guess maybe I'll explain a couple of things about how I view gender relations. So when we talk about men and women, there's kind of two things we're talking about. And this is where I find, for example, like the trans community and like kind of philosophies within the trans community has been really helpful, which is this recognition that there is this sex piece, and then there's also this gender piece. And one of them seems a lot more flexible than others. And then there's this other piece within the trans community called like a non-binary approach, which kind of argues that like just because somebody is a female doesn't mean that they have to be feminine necessarily. They can engage in masculine traits, right? And so I would very much view it as like, when people hear this, you're going to hear like divine feminine, divine masculine. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean like as a society, it seems to be the case that we kind of agree that there are traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine things. But I actually think that individuals from either sex category can engage in both to more or less degree. So women in general tend to be more feminine overall, right? They tend to embody more of the feminine traits, which is like an abstract concept. And that makes sense. And there's some like reasons for why that is. And men tend to be more masculine. But we have individuals who are women who tend to actually embody a lot of masculine traits, and a lot of men who are more feminine. And so I think it's really valuable to like recognize where you are in these things. Because in my view, a healthy person tries to have a decent balance of healthy feminine and healthy masculine.
Yeah, I'll probably agree with that. But so yeah, I totally think people should be able to do what they want. Like if a woman wants to be a plumber, that's like up to her, right? If she wants to if a dude wants to be a nurse or something like that, like I have no problem with that. But do you think like we should encourage people to cross the masculine feminine gap? Because my argument would be that I think the masculine feminine gap is totally fine. And I think sexual polarity is actually what makes things very interesting. Like typically men prefer more feminine women, and typically women prefer more masculine men, right? That's why women typically like guys with beards and muscles, and why men like women who are like, like cute and pretty and stuff like that, right? So would you argue that we need to bridge the gap, or you're fine with the gap?
The issue with, so this is basically the social prescription area. So I would argue that basically like we have these historically much more rigid boxes, like women kind of must be this within the gender role box and men kind of must be this. And we left a lot of people behind because of that, right? Men who didn't really fit the gender box very well and women who didn't fit their gender box very well. And so, of course, I would agree. It would be best to have a society where it just says, like, kind of do whatever you want, a little bit more egalitarian. If a woman wants to be a plumber, based, but also women don't have to be plumbers. And It feels like in our society, we're kind of, it's like, we feel like we were at this end where it was like way too rigid in gender roles. So now we're like at a governmental level trying to like force the reversal. And it feels very, unnatural, I guess. I don't know how efficacious it is, essentially, but I also don't know how to. I want to see a reduction in those rigid gender roles. Like I want there to not be so much a bridge. I want there to kind of be like an open landscape, and people can kind of traverse from either side. How to do that prescriptively in a society? I prefer a bottom up, which would be like just changing social norms rather than government intervention. I think government intervention is not the best for setting up gendered norms specifically. Conversations like this, I think, is better than the government like saying like you must hire 4 women in this field and stuff like that, like caps and stuff like that. Yeah.
That we definitely agree on. What would you say are some of the social norms that could use a change?
So for example, this is tricky. So right now, we're kind of in between 2 norms, I would argue, because we kind of have the gender abolitionists that are like a growing movement, and then we have more the gender traditionalists, and there's not a lot of space in between. So there's a lot of gender abolitionist norms that I would want to reject, and a lot of gender traditional norms that I would want to reject. If we focus on just trad stuff, like traditional gender norms, for example, I would basically want to reduce the idea that if somebody of a gender is not occupying their gender box, that there's something inherently bad or shameful, and that people would react in some sort of negative way, right? So if we hear about a guy becoming a nurse, people have like a lot of times still this a bit of internal like cringe. I would like to see that reduced, but that's not going to be reduced by like government intervention. That's going to be reduced by like conversations. And like, if you notice like your uncle across the dinner table being like, oh, that's kind of weird that he's a nurse, be like, why? They're stronger, especially like if he's got to be lifting like heavier bodies. That's amazing, actually. So definitely occupational. So the main thing I want to see is the reaction to the rigidity. I think a lot of people are still, if a man is being more effeminate, if he's into art or stuff like that, they're going to be like, oh, this guy's effeminate. They might call him a pussy, stuff like that. I'd like to see that reduced of just space of like a guy can be more effeminate, and it doesn't have to be like a cringe thing necessarily, especially if he's being healthily feminine.
So it's like shame for doing something that goes outside of your gender norm, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I mean, sure, I don't think like a male nurse should be shamed for doing what he wants. Like, the movie Meet the Parents, right? Like the whole running joke is that he's like a male nurse. A movie like that could not come out right now because there would be so much pushback. But yeah, like I wouldn't be like, I don't think anyone should be shamed for doing, like, I think there are some men who are just more feminine, and for them to like act masculine would just be like very unnatural versus I think there's also some women who are a little bit more on the masculine side. The one thing I would say is the dating marketplace does reward sexual polarity. So I think for women, it doesn't matter because women have so many options when it comes to dating. Like women typically are the gatekeepers when it comes to that. So like you could be a more masculine woman, more feminine woman, like you'll still meet plenty of guys. But as a guy, the dating marketplace can be very brutal. So if you're like a more feminine guy, you're just gonna be like lonely, right? More often than not, unless you're like really cool arts, you got like your photographer and you're banging the models. Aside from that, like the dating marketplace is going to punish you, and you really can't do anything against that because dating is not logical, right? It's emotional, and it's your desires, right? So that can't be logically changed. You might, as a woman, want to be attracted to a more feminine guy. You might tell yourself that you should, but you can't force yourself to be attracted to something that you're not. So that would be my only counterpoint to that.
I think people that tend to probably stray a little bit more outside of their box are also more likely to find partners who do similar. For example, I definitely don't match the traditional feminine gender box very well. I tend to be quite assertive and like aggressive at times. I'm very career oriented. I'm definitely like a lot more thing oriented. So in a lot of ways, my personality maps onto the more masculine. In a lot of ways, my husband maps a little bit more into the feminine. Even though if you looked at us, you would think that I'm decently feminine and he's decently masculine. And I think part of why our relationship works is that we both stray outside of the box. So there's probably a kindred spirit there. And then we kind of probably offset each other's like femme and mask within the relationship itself. But I would agree for probably 70% of people dating, the traditional gender roles to more or less does work. And I'm fine with that. I have no problem with traditional gender roles working. I just also like increasing the space for the 30% where it doesn't work. But that 30% is more likely, I think, to interdate as well.
Yeah, I think no one should be shamed for doing anything wherever they want to be on the gender spectrum. But I do think that it's important to tell, especially men, the truth. Like, and that's why it's something I see. Like, and just to be clear, I'm not like a right wing person or anything like that. I'm kind of down the center. But that's something I do see on the left is they're like, oh, as a man, you want to be ultra sensitive. That what the girl likes, and like, don't worry if you're like, don't go to the gym and you're overweight and like all that stuff. But you're just pulling wool over those guys' eyes because they just get obliterated by the dating marketplace, and then they just eventually they just become an incel, right? And then they go too far in the other extreme. So it's like you do have to tell the men the truth. Like, hey, listen, if you want to be more feminine, that's your choice. You shouldn't be shamed for it. But you will probably get less success with women. Just kind of is what it is. Like kind of like I did watch like a stream with you and your husband. Your husband is definitely not feminine. Like by the way he carries himself. Like I would not make that characterization at all. The only thing that seems to be like kind of flop between you two is that you're more focused on career. I think you said that he wants to be like a stay-at-home dad, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he's very, very other-oriented. Like a lot of men have a pretty easy time pursuing career for themselves. Whereas if you see in a lot of more traditional gender relationships, women are oftentimes a lot more willing to come in behind their husband's career and be like a supporter, right? There's like a really common dynamic where like the man becomes the business owner, he starts a small business, and the woman kind of supports him in like an assistant role. And it works pretty well for them as well. That would not work for Nick and I because he's terrible at doing stuff just for himself. He's just not interested. He doesn't care about career. And I'm not a very good assistant. Like I don't get any joy from it. I'm definitely way more self-focused than he is.
If you don't mind me asking, how long have you guys been together for?
So we've been married. It'll be 5 years in August. And then we were dating for, I believe, 1.5 years. So it'll be 6.5 years in total.
It's like a moderate rate of time. I guess like, okay, this is kind of a different point. This is just an observation I personally have. Like, I've just noticed I've had a lot of like my friends in high school where like, they get married, they have a kid, right? And maybe the wife makes a little bit more money than the husband. So they make a logical decision. The husband will stay home with the kids, right? Which makes sense on the surface, right? Like if the woman makes 200,000, the guy makes 100,000, someone has to stay home with the kids. Why not the person makes 100,000? The problem is what I've seen is a lot of those relationships, actually pretty much every single one that I've ever seen ends in divorce because the wife, and my theory is this, that the wife, I think she wants to respect the husband. She logically is very appreciative of the husband being a stay-at-home dad. But I think at some point, I think she just loses attraction for the husband, and it's like outside of her control. It's not her being a bad person. I just think there's something primal there. So I guess it'd be really interesting to see where your guys' relationship is in 20 years. I'm not saying like every relationship has to follow that pattern. That's just like the pattern I've noticed. I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
When it comes to I think the divorce around money making is probably really, really complex. I don't think it's simple as like he's making more money and therefore I'm less attracted to him. I think there's probably a lot of things. So when we like look at men in society in general, basically every marker of success they're doing poorer on than women right now. So that doesn't mean that they're on a decline right now, but men have sort of plateaued and are slowly ticking down, whereas women are steadily ticking up. So these areas I'm talking about would be education, income, and basically like overall life success. So like pretty topical stuff, but in general, women tend to have better relationships. They have better interpersonal relationships, more friendships, more stable friendships. They tend to be more educated now, and they're increasingly more educated, and they're probably because they're more educated, they're also starting to make more money overall. And so what we have to do is look at like, why are men not achieving these things? And it's probably also not simple. And so if we think that like women are consistently kind of trending up, and this isn't to say that women have no problems, just to be clear, women do have a lot of problems that they come across, but it seems like the problems men are facing are consistently growing, and we don't really have a finger on why precisely these problems are growing, right? Men are disproportionately homeless, they're disproportionately killing themselves, and they're disproportionately addicted to substances. And it also disproportionately doing crime, but that's historically always been the case. So if we look at these first three, for sure, we have to look at like, why is this the case? Why are they addicted, basically sad and killing themselves, and not pursuing education? What's going on here? And I think it's really complex. Number one, getting an a bachelor's is just not as rewarding for men. Like if you can go to the trades or spend 4 years getting like a stupid bachelor's, you're going to make more money short-term in the trades. The problem is that the trades break your body. So by the time that you're like 45, 50, you've got severe chronic pain. You don't have a lot of other career options because you've been specialized into like a trade. Whereas women, trades are just not as an option for them. They're highly physically demanding. They're also male dominated. And to be honest, I don't think women are just interested in them, which is totally fine.
Yeah, who the fuck wants to be a plumber?
Yeah, I think the most common job for women is nursing right now, which is a minimum of 4-year degree. So like women are necessarily having to pursue higher education for the jobs that they want. And men don't have to. So that's like one factor in and of itself. However, having that education opens a lot of opportunities, especially later in life as like plan B. Like, okay, well, my body's starting to erode. Now what? It's really interesting. There's a study coming out soon. One of my, I shouldn't say friend, but acquaintances I've met who does really cool research is looking a lot at intergenerational trauma, particularly among men. And if you look at like the past century, which group has been disproportionately killed off and destroyed by like war at a psychological level?
Men. Course.
Men, they're going to war, they're dying, and then they come back with PTSD. Now, I'm not saying that women didn't have problems in war, just with the caveats for my chatters to be like, women had problems too. Of course, women had problems, right? They picked up all the labor force. They had to basically solely provide. And then they had these PTSD husbands coming home, and they didn't have a lot of rights at the time. So there was a lot of responsibility on the woman with not a lot of freedom. But you have all these men coming home, or more importantly, not coming home, and then children being raised by lack of fatherlessness or unhealthy men because they have PTSD. It's really hard to be a parent and be a really emotionally available, role model for your child when you're in the midst of PTSD. But after both of the wars, we didn't even have a word for PTSD, and we certainly didn't have a treatment. And then we go to the Vietnam War. Again, who's going? Young men, right? Young men are going. Not a lot of them are coming back. When they are coming back, a lot of them were hooked on heroin, though most of them got off within a year. And a lot of them had PTSD because the Vietnam War was messed up, right? And so we have this like long history of essentially like the fathers not being there for various reasons. And then we get shocked that like men are not doing as well emotionally. And it's like, how would they? Like, who's modeling this for them? Like, women can definitely model for their sons certain things, but I think this is something that's been wrong a lot of times, is this idea that like what works for emotional regulation and emotional strategies for women is the same as men. It seems to be not the case, right? Women seem to process a lot in social interactions, right? For a lot of women, just talking about their feelings is sufficient. For a lot of men, it's not. They're like, I talked about my feelings, and the problem still exists. Men are much more typically problem focused emotional regulators. That seems to be the healthiest strategy that they utilize. But if you don't have like male role models demonstrating that, if you have men coming back that have PTSD, that are treating their wives terribly, they're treating their children terribly, you have, again, constant role models of men. And this isn't to blame any group. This is the problem, is I think both sides of the conversation just want to blame the other gender. It's like, it's not really that simple. It's like messy people fucking up, and messy people make messy situations. So you got these unwell men trying to role model for boys. And then we have a growing cognitive movement in psychology that's teaching us that there are certain ways to emotionally regulate, and they don't seem to be as geared toward men. For example, tell me if you want me to pause, because I can talk about this forever, because psychology is my background.
You're a therapist, though, right?
I'm not a therapist. I'm not a therapist. I'm a licensed addictions counselor. I'm a psychometrist. I've also worked as a psychometrician, so psychological assessment, and I have a bachelor's in psychology and a graduate diploma in.
Okay, so you have a good. What's the difference between what you do and a therapist? Sorry, this is one part.
So I'm not like a licensed psychologist. I don't have a full master's. So the graduate diploma is about 1.5 years, and there's no thesis dissertation with it, and a little bit less supervision, and there's no counseling training. So I'm not like a psychologist. And so I'm not licensed to do like one-on-one counseling at all. I kind of could as an addictions counselor, but I would never want to do that. So
Okay.
Those are the main differences. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Well, I want to comment on what you said because you said a lot. So I do agree with you. Like, I don't necessarily disagree with anything you said. And there's so much you touched on. So let me just go one at a time.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry.
no, it's all good. It's all good. And then we can like pivot back to the initial thing because also this is an interesting side tangent. But I would say that yes, I agree that men, it typically nowadays it seems to be either going to be successful or they're going to be losers, right? It's like it's extremes, right? Either the guy's going to be ultra successful CEO, like just have a crazy cool life, and maybe not. Maybe he's a CEO, he's rich, but he's also like like a loser, right? That can happen as well. Or he's going to be like a homeless drug addict, right? And there's less in between versus women. The in between is much more prevalent. Like women is more like, she'll just go to college, get a decent job, and have a decent career. Like stuff like that is much more common. So I do think that's a thing with men. I think it has to do with risk taking. I think men are much more prone to taking risks on average, and that can either pay off or it can punish you, right? Like you can take a risk, it succeeds, you're a millionaire, you fail, you're broken homeless, right? Addicted to crack. Now, in terms of why that number is dropping off, like why is there less men who are going to college? I think there's several factors to that. You can tell me if you agree or disagree with these. I think the first one is, well, first off, I think a lot of people, just not just men, but people in general, are realizing that college isn't quite what it was made out to be for a long period of time. And this is coming from someone who went to college. I went to Boston University. I had a scholarship. So I'm not like some like high school dropout who's like saying, oh, college is overrated. Like I actually went to college. I have a good degree. But, it's the conclusion that me and like all my college friends came to is like, you can't really do that much with this degree. I mean, you could, but not probably what you want. So I think a lot of people are realizing that, and they're saying, okay, well, maybe I'll just start my own business. I'll invest. I'll get into a trade, blah, blah, blah. The second thing is I do think that men nowadays have less good role models than the previous generation. So I think like there was like, like maybe like 30 years ago, men had like role models they can look up to, right? Versus now it's like a lot less men have role models. Like what's really bizarre is that I've actually become a role model for a lot of men, which is really weird to me because like I guess I'm like somewhat successful, but I don't think of myself as like an ultra successful guy. But it's like but yeah, like I think men have a total lack of role models, especially when it comes to like masculinity or dating or just what it means to be a man. Like a lot of men are confused about okay, what it means to be masculine. Like some people think it's like being like fresh and fit, which is like yelling at girls and arguing, which is like not masculine. It's just like being a little bitch, right? But some of them think it's like, maybe like, oh, I should be really empathetic and really compassionate. But that's great, but that's also not really what it means to be masculine. So I think that's the second factor. I think third factor is technology. I think technology has made people lazy. Like I think when I was growing up, like if you want something, you have to kind of go out and do it. If you want to hang out with your friends, you have to ride your bike over to their house. If you wanted to start a business, you kind of had to like go out and leave your house. Now it's like everyone does everything online. So I think that's had a negative effect on men. I think women in general to some extent for sure. But I think that like, I think men are just become like more antisocial. I think it's more important for men to be social because women are naturally good at being social. So a woman can like spend a lot of time indoors and then like go out and she can still socialize because that part of her brain is just like on average more developed versus for a man, like you need to practice being social. Like if you're like a man, you're isolated in your apartment for a month, you're going to go out there. You're going to be like an alien. You're going to be like, hello, nice to meet you, young lady. Like you're just going to be awkward as hell. So those are kind of like my three takes on that.
Yeah. So you started by saying men either do good or bad and then not as much in between. I would say more so men are more extreme. So if they're going to do good, I think they often can do really, really good and they'll often occupy the upper thing. But when men do bad, they tend to do extremely bad. Whereas I think like there is actually a lot of men in between. I don't think there's as much this idea that like men are doing one or the either. I think it's more so like men tend to be extreme in most ways. So when men do bad, they do worse. When men do good, they do better. As far as like better would be career is what you outlined, and worse was also career, homeless and addicted to drugs. So that's more so how I view it. I think there's actually a ton of men in between. I mean, most people, a lot of men occupy blue collar jobs that do a lot of work and trades and they make a really good wage. They're kind of like average hockey bros who just like have a wife. They have a couple of kids. Most small towns and most suburbia is filled with these people. The problem is that when men do worse, I think they do much worse. And I think there's less compassion, I mean, even empirically, there's pretty good evidence that we broadly just don't have as much compassion for men. And therefore, there's also a lot less resources. And so I think that's more so what's happening, right? When you have a man who's addicted to substances, there's more of them, but also there's a lot of resources available, but it seems like the efficaciousness isn't great. And there's not as many like grants. Like if you I've worked at a women's addiction center, and the amount of like grants that we can get is insane. Like people love giving money to women's addiction centers. I can tell you that men's addiction centers are not as sexy. You can't make as cute of posters. They just don't sell as well to like the average donor for like a nonprofit company. Not less healthy male role models. I would fully agree, but I would extend it beyond 30 years. I would extend it to like, I don't think we've had a ton of super healthy male role models for like at least a century because of these repeated wars. And I really do see this chronic, intergenerational trauma. And to be clear, I think it's affecting both, but there's this fair bit of evidence that like the same gender role model parent is really, really important for the child's like identity formation, especially like if the same sex parent is really unhealthy, it seems to do a lot of damage to the same sex child and different damage to the opposite. And if it's really healthy, then there's the vice versa effects. Colleges less payout. I would just agree. I think overall degrees are getting watered down because at this point, you basically need a degree to do anything. And if you ask people, are you working in the field you got trained in? I think the number of people who say no is just steadily on the increase, which is concerning, right? It's like, why do we even have this then? And I'm a big academic, so I've got like a serious bone about that. And I want academia to be for what academia is for, which is like nerds who want to like pursue wisdom and do research and stuff like that. And if you want to get trained in like technical skills, that's fucking based. We should just make more technical schools for that. So that like, if you want to be like an HR person, you don't really need to take an evolutionary biology class. There's no reason for that. It's just like 10 grand or however much your school is per class for not really a lot of bang, right? A lot of bachelors could probably be shortened to 2 years for most people, and they would be adequately trained for the field that they're interested in. Excluding nursing, probably there's a lot of work that nurses have to do. What does it mean to be masculine? I think is huge under attack, and I would agree with you. Obviously, as you saw, like my husband and I do a lot of talking about men and masculinity, and it seems like a lot of men that at least I talk to, and in fairness, this is selection bias because they're men who probably like my content telling me this, but they basically say like, it's really tough because in the feminist spheres, they're basically saying everything that works for feminism is what men need. Men just need feminism. And it doesn't seem to appeal to a lot of guys. And they're like, I don't really need that. I don't need to like talk about my fifis. I need to like stop being depressed. And the issue is talking about their fifis doesn't seem to do it for a lot of men.
Well, what does fifi mean?
Sorry, feelings.
Oh, feelings. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, there's this whole interesting thing of like, do you know what metascience is?
Metascience? No.
Yeah. So it's researchers who study the practice of science itself. So the problem with like something like psychology is there's always going to be biases imbued by the researchers themselves. This is called like observer effect. So by measuring something and by putting it in a lab, you inherently somewhat change it, and researchers have biases. So they might imbue their biases into the data and the interpretation of the data. So metascience is all about improving science overall. It's super cool if you're a nerd like me.
Okay.
And one question that's being propped up in metascience about psychology is that a lot of research on like therapy is dominantly done with sample populations that are 60 to 70% women, because that's typically who's going into humanities. That's typically the college students in psychology. And there's more women in college overall now. But the issue is that if we say CBT works really well, is it working as well for men as it is for women, right? And it's a similar paradigm that we had in medicine, but opposite, right? For a long time, all of like formal medicine was only done on like men, and oftentimes it was like college-age athletic men. The problem is college-age athletic men don't map on super well to women because women have estrogen and progesterone. So that's why, for example, I'm sure you might have heard this, like the symptoms of a heart attack in a woman is different than a man. For men, there's a lot of like chest pain, whereas women, they get a lot of like indigestion and stuff like that. So there's kind of this question of like, do we actually have this bias in therapeutic research? Because we know therapy works, but does it work as well for some populations as others? And that question is still pending. So yeah, men are in a really tricky boat right now. And finally, technology, it makes people lazy. I guess to that, I would say technology has changed the landscape. And the problem is that it's changed the landscape in a way that I think has made dating very different than what it used to be. And I think it really caters to women in some ways and some men in other ways. And then there's this weird dynamic that the more men, these like, fuck boys and whatnot that hurt women, these women become way more distrustful of all men, and that's going to make them harder to like date and whatnot, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I think in a lot of ways, like we often tell men to go to the wrong places to meet women, especially depending on like what they're interested in. Like if you just want to like sleep with somebody, that's a different partner oftentimes than if you're looking for like a long-term relationship. And I think, like I always tell men, if you want to meet like a really nice girl and you want a long-term relationship, volunteer. Just volunteer somewhere. Homeless shelter, SPCA. There's a lot of really nice, really cute, often educated women who are just like honestly super lovely. And they're almost never on dating apps because they hate dating apps.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with anything you said. But going back to the previous point, I guess my question would be this. And of course, we're just now talking in terms of averages because for every rule, there's like 20 million exceptions. But do you think like if you have a situation where you're like in a relationship or you're married and the man takes a more traditionally feminine role, like being the stay-at-home dad, do you think that increases the likelihood of the woman losing attraction?
Not inherently. I think the problem is that I think this is really complex. Women are doing better, which means if they've been in a relationship for a while, I think they realize that like they might be able to do better. And they're often right. That's part of the issue. Whereas a lot of men, I'm going to be honest, aren't working on themselves super well. I think men are oftentimes focusing on the wrong things as far as like being a good partner. The skills to be a really good partner are very different than what it takes to be a really good worker. Super different. And men are almost never socialized to be like good partners or like what that even means. And so I don't think it's exclusively her losing attraction because he's like in a trad femme role. It's probably a mixture of like, I do think a lot of women are looking for some level of like more traditional dominance in the relationship. And a trad femme role is inherently non-dominant, but a man can be in a traditional femme role and still be a decently dominant, like more assertive guy. There's just you have to think about it and work on it. I think in general, a lot of people get married and when they settle down, they also stop trying. And people get sick of that. And it seems like women have some element of like, I can probably do better and they'll leave. Whereas men feel like they don't ever feel like they could leave. They're kind of like, oh, I got one. So like, I cling, I can't ever change it up. And I don't know fully why that is.
I can totally
dating so hard for men. Yeah.
I can totally explain that. Yeah. It's actually quite simple because women, like any woman, even like my girlfriend, for example, she keeps her Instagram on private. She doesn't do any thirst traps, still gets her DMs blown up by like random guys who like even know that she has a boyfriend, right? And they just don't care. So women are getting, and like now imagine if she had a public Instagram and she put thirst traps, how many DMs would she get? So the point I'm making is that like any girl is just constantly given options. Hey, what's up, man?
Okay.
Did you get the GoPro working?
Yeah, it works. Thanks. Sorry, my camera was messed up before.
But yeah, so like I think any girl is just repeatedly throughout her life is just like thrown, like men are showing interest. So of course she thinks she can do better because that day she got like 10 dudes sliding in her DMs. She had 3 guys go up to her and give her a compliment, right? And I get it, based on how attractive you are, it depends on how. But even a less attractive girl is still going to have some guys showing interest in her versus a guy, unless he's like insanely good looking, insanely successful, or he puts himself out there, he's not going to have women showing interest. Like as a guy, like I'm telling you, like the only people who slide in my DMs are like dudes who like my channel. It's not hot chicks sliding in my DMs. Very, very rarely does that happen. And like I would say I'm like probably above average looking, like, and I have like a little bit of clout, right? So like the point I'm making is that like it's, yeah, like if you're the average guy, like you're just going to work, maybe you have like an Instagram where you have your kids on there, no chicks are sliding in your DMs. But if you're a girl doing the same thing, a bunch of guys are sliding in your DMs, a bunch of guys are giving you compliments. So that's why you think as a woman, of course you think you can do better because there's been 20 million men who've shown interest in you.
I think it's mixed though. A lot of women, when I talk to them who've like left a relationship, they're not even necessarily saying I can do better. They're basically saying I can't do this, because I think a lot of women feel like they're carrying the bulk of the weight in a relationship, particularly at the relational and emotional level, which is what a lot of women are looking for long-term stable relationships. And I think that there's a lot of validity to this. Like we said, women are generally better at relationships and social exchanges, and therefore a lot of times when it comes to like interpersonal dynamics, I think a lot of women are carrying the weight. And then we also have things like the household economy, where women are working often just as much or maybe a couple hours less, but they're oftentimes at the household economy doing like 60 to 70% of the work. And so a lot of women are just like, holy fuck, I don't even know if I can do better. I just can't do this. It would literally be easier to get a cat. And then on the converse, they're still lonely and they still want a relationship, but they don't want a relationship that feels like so unbalanced to them and unfair. Yeah, I'll stop there.
But you would acknowledge that like the massive discrepancy in interest at least plays a role, right?
Interest in what way?
Like in terms of like from the opposite sex, meaning like you're a married husband, no one's really showing that much interest in you unless you're like some exception to the rule. Versus if you're a regular married woman, a bunch of guys are showing interest. Like I would stake my life that there's plenty of guys who know you're married and still like show interest in you, slide in your DMs and be like, hey, you're a dude, how's it working? How's it going with your husband? Like, so like I think that is just a huge factor in of itself.
Yes, I will be very honest. My experience with like men in my DMs is very disparate from most women. I actually have it very rarely. I've never had somebody send me an unsolicited dick pic ever. Yeah, never. And just in general, I tend to be, even though I'm at like a more public figure, exceedingly undersexualized. I'm not totally sure why that is precisely. I'm still trying to figure it out. But I'll be clear. I know that I have a very different experience in that way, because most women I talk to, yes, they're getting a lot of head-ons. The issue is they're getting a lot of comments. Most of them aren't very pleasant or attractive, though. Most of them are not things that you want to get, right? There's a lot of like men being
I know
violating social, being kind of creepy and uncomfortable in their DM. So it's like, but maybe they're getting a lot.
Yeah.
But their list of actual viable options isn't huge. It's still bigger than men. And I'll fully say that. I think there are obstacles for men and women. I think men have more. I'll be very clear about that. But I don't want to like say that all women just have like all their DMs blown up and it's all these hot giga chads with lots of money and yachts and like a good personality. That's not really the case.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, no, for sure. I mean, I think like, I think what happens when a woman is in a relationship, she just like, if she's like committed to the relationship, she's just not gonna even entertain all those offers. Like she might laugh at it, but that's about the extent of it. But I do think it's still going to be in the back of her mind, which is not like necessarily problematic. Like I think that's just human nature. Like I don't, I know for the fact that, my girlfriend gets hit on, but I don't really care. Like it doesn't bother me because I'm secure in our relationship. But yeah, I do think that does play a factor for sure, especially if you're a guy, like the average guy, he hasn't been with that many women. He doesn't have that much experience. So he is like kind of clinging on. So we do agree on that. Like he's like, for the love of God, if this girl leaves me, like I'll never do better. Versus the girl is like, I can probably do better. Like I think I'll be okay. Most of the time, I think.
Yes, but just to be clear, like women are not like particles that like move along concentration gradients or anything. Like women are not just these like simple creatures who just like move by whims of like flesh and pleasure, right? I'm not. I don't think you're saying that. I just want to like make that caveat, like put in there that like yes, I do think women have more options, but almost every woman I talk to, that's at least pretty emotionally regulated, when they're looking at leaving a relationship, the fact that there's men in their DMs is kind of like the surface level dismissal of like how sad they are that they have to end the relationship and walk away. Like it's like, well, like at least I have other options, right? And they'll often escape into that after the breakup and be like, well, I have lots of other options, and they'll date lots of men. But most women, when I hear about like the reasons that they're ending relationships, it's typically dissatisfaction and imbalance in like interpersonal dynamics and the household economy, which I think are really fair. And I think that this is something that oftentimes in men's spaces gets missed. And in women's spaces, all of men's problems get missed.
All right. Although to be fair, when like a person walks away from the relationship, the reason that they give is typically, unless they're very self-aware, not the actual reason the relationship.
It's a cope. Yes.
Yeah. There's a huge. No, I fully. That's like one of the beefs I have with like the red pill, black pill community is like, yeah, they do kind of have this idea that women are these like creatures who have zero impulse control, who are just like, as soon as they see a stimuli, they have no choice but to go to that stimuli. And to be fair, there is a small percentage of women who are like that, but that is a small percentage. Like, vast majority of women do have impulse control, and some better than others for sure. But like, yeah, like a woman is just like, just because some higher value guy goes up to her doesn't mean she has to fuck him, right? Like, most women exercise like basic like self-control. So that's like one of the things that like I've called out the red pill black pill community on.
Yeah, I feel like the red pill sometimes characterizes women as like these girls walking around like dragging their knuckles with like an ahi gal face, just being like, oh my gosh, like where's the hottest guy? And it's just like, oh my gosh, guys, like women are more complex than that. Like, and in fairness, on the feminist side, we often just like characterize like, or men are often characterized as like knuckle dragging rapists who are just like out to like predate on women.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
like,
there's
here's
complexity
a
on
girl,
both
let me
sides.
rape her real quick. Oh, here's another one. Like,
yeah. Unsurprisingly, both movements are a little bit wrong and a little bit right. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think we largely agree on this point. I guess let me pose the question like this: What would you say are some things that you agree, and then some things you disagree with, like the pickup red pill community on?
I'd have to think about it. The red pill community seems really dynamic, so I'm going to make characterizations, and you can tell me if you feel like they're accurate of it. One of the biggest things that I think, I'll maybe focus on pickup artists.
Okay, let's start with that. Yeah, that's the community I know better anyway. So
sure. One of the biggest things that I think pickup artists get wrong is while they're really good at soft skills, they're really good at cold approach, and they're really good at like small talk, essentially. And they're really good at teaching men how to be good at both of these things. They're missing, mystical crystal guys who are like super woo-woo and stuff like that. And they slay. Like, they get a lot of girls, right? Like, they do very, very well. I don't know if they do really well, honestly. Like they do quite well, especially if they like lean into it hard. Like, you'll see a guy who's like very woo-woo and like into crystals, and he'll have like 6 really attractive women that are all like in a poly relationship with him. I think pickup artists is missing exactly what those men are best at, which is that these men tend to be highly in tune to women's emotions, and they care about them a lot and are willing to kind of like carry water in the emotional relationship with the women, which the reality is like women do really want that. Like, they really, really do want that. And I think pickup artists really miss that. So they're good at the soft skills. I don't think any pickup artist skills are going to be good at maintaining a long-term relationship, though, if that's your goal. Because cold approaches and small chat is not all that's required for a long-term relationship.
I would disagree with that. And this is coming from someone who did a lot of cold approach and is in a relationship, right? So I think that you're partially right. Directly doing cold approach is not going to make you better at having a girlfriend or being in a relationship. However, through the process of doing cold approach, you actually wind up getting over a lot of your insecurities, right? That's what happened to me. I used to have quite a few insecurities. Now I don't have any, with the possible exception of my receding hairline. No, but even that I don't really care about. So like, yeah, so it's like through the process, you do become more confident. You do become more in tune with like what you want, what your desires are. Like when I was like, I lost my virginity when I was 19. When I was like 20, 21, like my sex life was very standard. Basically, I had no idea what I wanted. Like versus now, after having a lot of sex, I know exactly what I like sexually. I know exactly what I like in a woman, what qualities outside the physical that are good for me, what are bad for me. So I do think it's like there's a massive self-development, self-growth aspect to doing pickup, which I do think makes you a better partner.
I would fully agree. So that's probably something I looked up. Pickup artists are good at these 2 soft skills, and they're really good at making men learn how to take their L's and just move on. And to be good at taking a rejection, you fundamentally have to have some level of like self-assurity, being like, that's okay. I have some intrinsic value. I'll try the next one. Another big criticism I have of pickup artist world is the ethics. I'm very big on giving advice that's focused on maximizing agency on both negotiators' part. So I don't mind what you want to negotiate in an interaction or relationship, but I want to make sure that both parties are maximizing each other's agencies. And I think a lot of pickup artists actively are teaching and encouraging men to do like tricky, sneaky things that actually inherently reduce agency of women and oftentimes lead to women having essentially like buyer's remorse. And in any interaction, especially a sexual interaction, you don't want to leave your partner with buyer's remorse. Like that's terrible. And that happens for a lot of women where they sleep with a guy, he ghosts her, and she's heartbroken. And that's really shitty. And that happens a lot.
I would agree. Okay, so I agree with the part that you don't want to have buyer's remorse. And well, first of all, it's shitty. But secondly, like that's how you skyrocket your chance of catching a rape charge. Like if the girl feels buyer's remorse, like obviously most girls will not do that. But like I'm very careful if I do hook up with a girl, like I don't want her thinking anything bad about me because I don't want to fuck with that at all. So like if I fuck a girl, like if she wants to sleep over, I'll typically let her sleep over. Now look, if she's like gets really out of line, I'll put like a stop to it. But I'll be way more nicer to a girl that I had sex with than a girl I didn't have sex with, simply because like I don't want to fuck with that like side of things at all. But in terms of like,
so that's kind of still in the vein of what I'm talking about, though, right? Like I don't want her thinking anything bad about me. It's like I think the orientation should be from a negotiation. I want both parties to be as happy as possible and not buy into anything that they don't want to.
Sure, but as a man, you do have to like. I do agree that the red pill community takes it way out of proportion. They make it seem like every other girl is just pressing false charges, which is not the case. The statistics on it are fairly low. But as a man, if you're going out and sleeping with a lot of girls, it is something you have to keep in mind, and you have to be pragmatic with it and do things that like even like for example, let's say you hook up with a girl and like you don't want her sleeping over. You're like, oh my god, she's being so clingy, right? You're probably better off like just going along with it, just to like decrease that chance of catching a false charge. So I do think as a man, you do have to be pragmatic about, just as a woman, you have to be pragmatic about not being raped, right? Like you might want to go into a social situation, but it seems like really sketchy. Like, you know, you can't just trust the other person will do the right thing. You have to be kind of pragmatic with your physical safety and then have to be pragmatic with their, you know, catching a charge, whatever safety.
Absolutely. As long as when it comes to sex, I really want to discourage everyone, because I think this isn't actually just a men's problem, but I really want to discourage people from thinking about how do I get mine? And it seems like a lot of people approach, especially in hookup culture, approach sexual relationships fundamentally from that. How do I get mine? And I think if you're approaching negotiations in that way, you're much more likely to cause buyer's remorse because you're more likely to do even like non-intentional, somewhat manipulative or somewhat like more underhanded, like social interactions and tactics to try to get yours. And I think that mentality in itself is what inherently makes things so much more risky for women.
Well, can you give maybe some examples of this? Like what are some like underhanded or manipulative stuff that you think that the pickup community might do? Or
Sure. So a lot of pickup artists will talk about nagging. Now, I like to steal the word nagging because I think it's been a little bit bastardized by the pickup artist. But if nagging is just teasing, right? Women and men actually love being teased. Like my main way, the best way to flirt with me is to like lightly tease me and mock me, right? Yeah. A lot of pickup artists, when they talk about it, though, they talk about intentionally trying to somewhat erode the girl's sense of security and sense of like safety so that she feels more likely to cling on to you. That is inherently reducing her agency because you're intentionally trying to basically decrease her sense of security and decrease her sense of like self-agency to get something from her, which is typically sex. You're doing these tactics to get sex eventually, right? And so that to me is underhanded because you're just like, you're basically to some extent being intentionally manipulative to get sex. And in that way, that is being underhanded. Hi.
Do you want anything to eat?
Mostly an ice pack. It's really hot in here.
What's up?
He's just asking if I want something to eat.
I got you. I would. Okay, that's the one. I would agree with that. I do think negging is definitely manipulative. However, to be fair, negging is like the MySpace of the pickup community. It's like super outdated. Like none of like the popular pickup content creators talk about negging anymore. And the reason I don't talk about it, yes, there is a manipulation factor, but also the vast majority of guys will butcher negging to death. So I do think teasing is a much easier, healthier, and just better way of like going about it. Like tease the girl, don't neg the girl. Because I've seen guys butcher negging so bad, like to the point where they're like, the girl's like, are you okay? Like that's like those kind of reactions. So, but negging is like super duper outdated. And I know like you're not part of the pickup community, so it's like, how would you know that? But it is just from like the pickup perspective, it is like super outdated. Like it's not something that's like commonly talked about or commonly encouraged anymore in the community. It's like MySpace. Like there's a few people who have it, but no one really cares about it, basically.
Sure. So another example I would give would be momentum. So utilizing momentum. So a thing that's often talked about in pickup artistry is kind of using some level of like yesing. So as you're kind of like cueing and doing different things, the momentum of the moment, you can kind of more naturally. So if there's kind of this psychological thing, right? If somebody says yes multiple times in a row, it becomes way harder to say no to you. And the emotional pressure to say no is increased steadily. The issue is that I hear a lot of pickup artists talk about utilizing momentum, right? And like kind of using those yeses and like following them along and doing like incremental increases of like implied or explicit consent. The issue is that I think it negates the fact that women we know are definitely socialized to be really bad at saying no. They are really bad at that. Now, in fairness, when I talk with women about this, the biggest thing I teach women is palatable boundaries, learning how to say no. I think it's really important for women to say no. But if you're constantly increasing momentum of yes, 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 then by the time that she maybe is uncomfortable and wants to say no, her rejection of you has to be so much bigger than if she was able to say no like more early on. So I think utilizing momentum can really mindfuck and put women who I think are less capable of navigating these things for lots of reasons at higher risk. Now, this isn't to say women are just dumb children and you just have to navigate around all their fifis and they just can't say no. But if we're aware that women are less assertive generally, they're less aggressive, and they're also socialized to not like be as good at like stating boundaries and stating what they want, momentum like actively utilizes all of this against them. And I think that's where we end up in a lot of situations, for example, where the woman says like kind of yes to sex, and then afterwards is like no. And then the man is like, wait, what? You said yes. And then I talk about this a lot. There's a lot of sexual assaults that occur where both parties are drunk, but B, the guy is very confident that he got consent and the girl is very confident that she didn't give consent. And when you dig into it and do more like qualitative, you see a lot of the women say, he just kind of kept pushing boundaries and I was okay. And then I was less okay, but I didn't want to say no. And then there's more boundaries and I still didn't want to say no and I felt uncomfortable. And then by the time it was happening, I didn't know how to say no. And I was like, because at this point, if you're naked and on the bed, saying no is way more awkward than like if you're just like touching her arm or kissing her.
Okay, so this might be the one area we disagree on because I actually do talk about momentum. Now, I want to preface this by saying I think momentum is different than pressure, right? So I'm like, I would never advocate like putting pressure on the woman to have sex, right? Like where it's like she has to do it or she's going to lose something. So that's not something I'd advocate of. However, I do think momentum is different. I think we do have to acknowledge the fact that for women, having sex typically, not always, but typically is an emotional decision. Meaning when a girl goes on a date with a guy, typically she's not like, I'm going to fuck this guy. Typically she's going into it with like, let's see what happens, right? Let's see how the date goes. I'm open to the idea of sex, or maybe she's not. Sometimes she's not, but more often than not, she's like, I'm open to the idea, but I haven't made a decision yet. Versus a guy, when he sees a girl, she's attractive. Like, unless she like throws up in his face, he's like, oh, I want to fuck this girl, right? So that has happened. And I do think that, like, as a guy, you do have to utilize good game principles, in order to have the kind of sex life you want. I don't think it needs to be manipulative, though. I think you can have a situation where you're just running good game, which doesn't have to be manipulative. Like an example of a yes matter that I would use is like, instead of like, okay, like if I'm at a bar, like with a girl, right, and I want to bring her back to my place, I could just be like, hey, do you want to go back to my place? That's a big ask, right? And typically if I do that, unless the girl has consciously decided she wants to have sex with me, she will say no, right? I'm going to definitely lower my chance of getting success. Or I could use momentum in my favor and I could be like, hey, let's go over here. Let's grab a drink, right? We go over there, we'll grab a drink. And that could be like, oh, you want to go check out this other bar? Then we go to this other bar. Hey, you want to check this out? And then we wind up back in my place, right? That would be, I would consider that an example of good game without actually doing anything manipulative, right? Because you can make the argument that's like low-key manipulative. Okay, fine, I'll grant that. But I still think that like that's just like something you kind of have to do in order to have a good dating results. I don't necessarily think it's bad because at no point are you putting pressure on the woman, right? That's where I would draw the line. And obviously, I don't believe like in violating consent. So if the girl winds up at your place and she says no, obviously that should be the end of it. But I think you can have your cake and eat it too, so as to speak with that.
So I think that's the issue is like, I don't think the purpose of a negotiation, the good results is to say, hopefully I get as much as I want, right? Which is sex. And I'm going to do kind of what I can to achieve my goal. In a good negotiation with a negotiation partner, you both figure out what both parties want, and then you kind of meet some level of compromise within that, right? Especially when it comes to sex, right? The commodity is each other's body, not just the woman's body, both of your guys' body, right? And so I think when you're utilizing momentum, it makes it increasingly hard to say no, especially if you're buying her drinks, you're driving her around, right? It becomes way harder to say no because the reality is like most women feel bad. Like most women aren't monsters who are just like trying to get men and take all their money and gobble, gobble, gobble. Yeah. Most women are like decently nice and he like buys her some drinks and he buys her some food and she's like, that's super nice and I appreciate that. The issue is that it becomes harder to say no. And I really want to encourage in all dating interactions, making no as easy as possible. And so that may come at risk of having less sex for the man. But if the trade-off is that women are increasingly more safe in all of their sexual interactions, I think that is fully worth it, because then we don't get into these weird, messy consent issues that often pop up, right? If you're doing these incremental yeses, but you know that she's now had 4 drinks, right? Her capacity to say yes is already decreased a fair bit. So if you're using momentum and there's alcohol involved, your ability to like foresee does she have enough agency is decreased, but also her agency is decreased as well. And so in this situation, by the time that she's like at the bar or at like the 3rd stage of like yesisms, now it's really hard for her to say no. Now she's got to find her own ride. She's going to feel really bad because you spent a lot of money on her. She's probably really likes you. She's maybe just not ready for sex. So she's like, oh, if I say no, I'm probably going to lose my chance of having any future interactions with this guy. And that's where I think you're getting manipulative and you're absolutely decreasing agency. And I think this is what's leading to a lot of women being harmed in sexual relationships.
Okay, I think I partially agree and partially disagree with you. So the part I agree on is, yeah, like I draw a hard line if a girl's like drunk or even like close to drunk, like that's like that's a no for me, right? And that's what I encourage for guys. Like if a girl's wasted, just get her number and hit her up the next day. Like you can make out with her, but I wouldn't like fuck a girl that's wasted, basically, right? So I do think that's good advice. So I think alcohol is definitely a confounding factor, and you should be very, very careful with that. I will acknowledge that. However, I do think that the problem with the analogy you made about like this. Okay, the other thing I'm preface it by saying is also I do think sex. I see this as a win-win. So I don't see this as a zero-sum game. You get sex from the girl, you taking something from her. I see this as a win-win. We're both having a good experience. We're both doing something we want. So that's like the fundamental, I think, underlying philosophy that is very beneficial for you as a man to have when it comes to sexual relations. With that aside, I do think the problem with that kind of what you said earlier about the negotiation is sex typically for women is not a logical decision. So women, like, it's not like you're sitting there and you're negotiating like, okay, so, if I have sex with you and then will you take me? It's never logical. It's usually an emotional decision. It's usually something women do in the moment when they feel the chemistry, right? And I think as a guy, it is your job to create that chemistry. Also, it is your job to make sex as easy as possible for her. Meaning, like, you could ask her to have sex with you when you met her at a bar and she's with all her friends, but even if she wants to fuck you, she'll probably say no. Or you could, ask her to have sex with you when you guys are already hooking up, making out, blah, blah, blah. Her friends aren't there, right? So it's your job, because if you don't do this, like, you will not get laid. Like, you will not meet girls. You will have a hard time getting anything, right? You do need, and the girl will also like probably like low-key blame you for it. And that's a whole other thing we can get into. But so I do think it's your job to make sex as easy as possible for the girl. And part of doing that is to utilize socially tactful momentum without using like some kind of extreme coercive pressure or alcohol, though. That would be the 2 things that I would say like would be a hard no.
Is there a way to make that as easy as possible, and that the focus is that the whole goal is to make the interaction as safe and as comfortable and as fun as possible, but also making it so that if she needs to say no, it's as easy and as comfortable for her to do so as possible, right? Because if you approach a girl and you put your hand on her back, and this would be a very standard cold approach, right? You approach a girl, you put her hand on her back, you kind of whisper in her ear and talk to her. The way she has to say
that would not be a standard cold approach. That would be like a very extreme cold approach.
Say it's in a bar. And I'm being clear. This is aggressive, right? I'm not saying this is what most people recommend, right? Yeah. If you do that, for her to say no, she has to be way more like forceful, right? The no has to be pretty big, and women are not super strong at saying no. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, women are part of this too. Absolutely. Just like women need to be mindful of like certain social things with men, right? Around emotionality and stuff like that. I think men have to be aware of like the socialization of women, and both try to be a little bit considerate of each. If you approach a girl and just say like, hey, how's it going? Like, and do like a much more normal cold approach, right? Her ability to say no can be as simple as just being like, oh, sorry, I'm busy. That's a really easy, soft rejection. She can basically get out of it without having to be like really in your face. And I agree, women need to get better at saying palatably no. That is a skill women absolutely in the dating market need to get better at. But I think if we're teaching men to do things like yes momentum, we're actually like reinforcing this paradigm of women like feeling less comfortable saying no. And there's always this power differential of like women being nervous, whether there's good reason or not good reason. There's nervousness that women have, and saying no for a lot of women, they know to men, is probably going to also ruin their chances with that guy in the future.
Okay, so I think there's one factor that I haven't mentioned yet that might kind of change your opinion. I think also another big part of this is being able to pick up on social cues and her body language. So if you're sensing the girl's really uncomfortable, like I never have situations where the girl has to be like, can you get away from me? That hasn't happened to me in like half a decade, right? Because I can pick up on her body language. And if she's like really closed off, not interested, I'll just be like, have a nice day. Like you don't even need to get to that point. Same thing if like, if the girl's back in my house and somehow she lost interest, which does happen from time to time, and her body language is really closed off, I'm not going to try to have sex with her, right? Because I can already tell. So you can even preempt the no, like majority of the time, just picking up on the situation, which is definitely a skill you need to master. So I would say like that's probably the big thing is like picking up on her body language, picking up on the social cues that she's giving you. Like typically a thing that, you know, this is kind of like a meme almost in the pickup community is when you're going home with a girl and she looks at you and she says, by the way, we're not having sex tonight. That typically means that she wants to have sex. And when that's happened to me, typically like, and I'm just always like, okay, cool, no worries. Typically we start having sex within like 5 minutes. Like the girl's the one like trying to fuck me. That's like almost a running joke. But it is like, if you're a guy who takes that very logically and you're like, oh, well, she said she doesn't want to have sex, right? You might not make a move. And then the next day you get a text from the girl like, hey, why didn't you do anything? Like I was really interested. Haha. Another issue that you can run into is that, and this is where things get really tricky, is a concept called backwards rationalization. So if a girl goes home with a guy and nothing happens for whatever reason, could be the guy's fault. Typically, unless there's a strong reason why the girl didn't want to do it, like maybe it's her period or something like that, she will backwards rationalize that she's just not that attracted to that guy, and she will not even give him a second date. Versus if a girl has sex with a guy, she will typically be like, well, there must be a good reason why I had sex with him. That must mean I'm attracted to it. And backwards rationalization is a very real thing. And it is something as a guy you have to be conscious of. I'm not saying the solution is to fuck every girl so she likes you. I'm just saying it is a real thing and it exists. So I think that, it's just the problem is that dating, like I would love to live in a world where I could just go to a bar, go up to a girl and be like, hey there, hi, do you find me attractive? Yeah, cool. Do you want to have sex tonight? Yeah, cool. Let's do it, right? That would be awesome for me. Like I would be full in favor of that. And like we can have a logical negotiation about sex. I'm down. Okay, yeah, you can fuck me, but you have to buy me dinner tomorrow night. I'd be like, okay, yeah, you like sushi? But it just never works that way. It's not logical. It's an emotional decision. So that's where you have to kind of use some social tact and game, i.e. what really is game is social tact, and you have to use that in order to kind of have a happy ending. I don't think but I think where you might be under the impression that a lot of pickup artists think sex is a zero-sum game where you're taking something from the women, which certainly there are men who think that. But I think me and like a lot of guys, we don't see it as a zero-sum game. We see it as a win-win. We see it as like she's getting good sex, we're getting good sex, we're having a good time. I think the only way it could not be a zero-sum game is if you guys are looking for two totally different things. So if she's like a Christian girl who's saving herself for marriage, who's a virgin, and you you game her into fucking you, like that's not a zero-sum game. I mean, that is a zero-sum game at that point because she like gave up something that she was saying. But as long as you guys are more or less on the same page, it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, which I think, but you do need to like take the lead and make sex happen, and that will fall on you. Like I would love it if women took the lead on that. Like that would be easy for me. I just show up on a date, I just bullshit, and the girl brings me back to her place. That would be awesome. That's not how it works.
Yeah, so it's interesting because what you're describing to me doesn't fully sound like yes momentum, which is typically what people pickup artists would tell men to do. Yes momentum is a demonstrable psychological trick to get people to be more likely to say yes with the big ask. It's basically like the foot in door. It's a sales tactic. And the issue is that the sales tactic of yes momentum, broadly in my view, does increase the risk of buyer's remorse. There's other ways that you could utilize like certain things like no-oriented questions, which are way better at maximizing agency, and you can still be pretty tactical and like charismatic in how you use them. The issue is what you're describing, like showing her different places and making a really interesting, fun date doesn't really sound like yes momentum. What you're doing is you're showing that you're cool, you're interesting, you know cool places, you're an interesting person. So they're naturally going to be more interested in you, and you're taking the lead, which they're also attracted to. The problem that I think we get into is the fuzziness around the edges between zero-sum game and egalitarian negotiation that has both parties happy at the end. And I'm not saying that you're in the pickup artist side where you're trying to minimize women's agency and trick them into bed with you. It sounds like what you're describing is teaching people how to have some level of what I would call perceived competence. I'm interesting, I'm cool, I'm confident, I'll take the lead, I'll drive you around, I have a bunch of ideas, right? I'm thoughtful. And that's very different to me than yes momentum, which is inherently aimed at building people up with a multiple series of yeses to get towards the big yes. And it doesn't sound like what you're describing is precisely that.
I will. I'm going to double down on that, but let me first just read a super chat because everyone in my chat keeps annoying me about this, and I have to read this because otherwise, like, I'm going to get distracted. And then we'll quickly go back to this. This is a cute conversation, but this time has passed for wealthy, fit men to have above average men to want USA women anymore. We're going overseas, blah blah blah. Your time, sister, has passed. So I appreciate the $100 super chat, but I think you guys know my position on this. I think that yes, the average quality of women in the U.S. on average has declined, but there's still plenty of great girls. All the girlfriends I've ever had, I met in America, and I've had several. So there's definitely still great women in the U.S. I don't think you necessarily have to go overseas to meet a great girl. And also, it's a little risky to do that, like outside first world countries, because how do you know the girl wants you for your personality and not your citizenship, right? So I would just by default be a little weary of dating a girl who's not a U.S. or EU citizen. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it, but I would go into it with more caution because you never know if she's really just trying to get the citizenship. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that. I don't know. Do you have anything to add on that before we go back to the initial discussion?
I'd mostly echo. I think this red pill idea that there's just like not really any good women out there and they're all like gold diggers, like trying to get them, and they're all like fat and lazy and ugly is just like, it's just not really borne out, like not even statistically. Like women are just, if we're saying women are doing better in all of these areas, having more income, having a better job, and all these things are predictive of a bunch of other psychological phenomena that also make you like, typically people who have more money are a little bit healthier and fitter and like, et cetera. So the idea that like there's just not really any good women out there, I just don't buy it at all. There's tons. They're just not usually on dating apps. I'm going to be honest. Because even that are burnt off of dating apps.
Even that, that's a common like stereotype that exists about dating apps. But like my girlfriend I met on Bumble, 2 girlfriends before I met on Tinder. My cousin met her husband and now father of her kid on Tinder. My aunt met her ex-boyfriend on Tinder. So like it does. I know that dating apps have this like reputation of being like a cesspool of shallow people, and there are of course those people out there. But there's also great people. Like dating apps have become really, really mainstream. So like your average girl next door probably at some point in her life has been on a dating app, whether that's for a week, for a month, for a year. So yeah, I think you can meet a good girl on a dating app. I wouldn't like, if I want a girlfriend, should I like get off Tinder? No, you can use Tinder as a resource, especially if you go to like less hookup oriented apps like Bumble and Hinge, right? Like, yeah, there's definitely great girls on there, but there's also great girls on Tinder. Yeah, so
volunteer. I think if you have this perspective of women, just go to just volunteer anywhere. You're going to meet a lot of nice, good, cute women. Go to hobbies, co-ed hobbies especially. Co-ed hobbies are a great place to meet women. They're fit, they're interesting, you've got a common interest that you can easily do for a date. I don't know. I think Tinder is like Rock Lee with ankle weights for men. Like it's just, I wouldn't recommend for anyone unless you're exclusively looking for hookups. Obviously there are going to be people who are like, but anecdotally, I found somebody and it's like, that is cool for you, but it's still not going to be what I recommend for the average person.
Well, I would say you can do both. Like, there's no reason why you have to do one or the other. You can download Tinder while you're like driving over to the volunteer place. While you're like, you can like. I think as a guy, you need to diversify your sourcing for girls. Like, you can't just be like, I'm only going to meet girls at bars, or I'm only going to meet girls on dating apps. You have to like widen your net, cast your net wide. I don't think it hurts you in any way to do that. I don't think dating apps necessarily like they don't cost that much money. They're not that time. Well, they could be time consuming, but they don't need to be. So yeah, like I think you could do either. And I even though this may be anecdotal, like the statistics are changing. Like a lot of like married couples and like couples in general are saying now that they met their partner on dating apps. Like that is becoming like more and more common. So I just think it becomes so mainstream that is definitely possible. You do need to know how to use them. Like dating apps, you do need to have really good photos. Right. You need to know how to text and message. So it is a skill for sure. Like I have a lot of clients who like just don't know how to use dating apps. And they're like, dating apps don't work. Well, they don't work for you because you're failing at them because you have 2 selfies and your bio says, hi, I'm a nice guy. Let's go out. So yeah, I would say that. But going back to the initial discussion, which we were having. So Yeah, so I have a little bit of interesting background on this. I worked in sales for 6 years, and I would say that there's a lot of overlap between sales and quote unquote game for guys. It's not a perfect overlap. There's some things that are different, and I think a lot of sales concepts can be beneficial for actually being better with women. And I would argue that big part of the reason why I have the quote unquote skills that I do, not to like sound like I'm braggadocious or something, is because I worked in sales. It's very beneficial. Like for guys who are like, what kind of career should I get that will increase my success with women? I always say do sales because that will teach you a lot of the traits. But so in sales, I used to sell like solar panels, which are like $30,000, home improvement projects. And like, even if a customer was interested in solar, like this is what I learned after a year of doing sales. I used to think sales was very logical, right? You decide, does this make sense for my house? But what I really learned is that sales is very much an emotional decision. This is why I used to suck when I first started doing sales. Is I would be very logical I'd be like, okay, so look, like you're spending $200 on your electric bill with this, you're going to spend 150. This makes sense. Let's do it. And I got a grand total of like close to zero sales. And then my sales manager, who was actually a really adorable 5'2" redhead girl, explained to me that this is actually an emotional decision. Like you can't, you don't want to logic your way into sales. It's an emotional decision. You have to make the customer feel comfortable. And yes, the concept of like a yes ladder is something you would use in sales. When you first show up to their house talking about solar, you're not going to be like, hey, do you want to put solar on your roof? You're going to be like, hey, blah, blah, blah. What about this small thing and this little bigger thing and this little bigger thing until you get them. However, just because you use the yes ladder does not, my company certainly did not want any like refunds or something like that cuts into profit lines. But, you don't need to, just because you make it very emotional and use a yes ladder doesn't mean you have like a high level of buyer's remorse, right? As long as the product is something that benefits them. And this goes back to my whole thing with game. As long as like your sex or whatever you guys do benefits the girl, meaning like she doesn't feel deceived, she was looking for something somewhat similar, you fucked her well, you didn't treat her like shit, you didn't kick her out, you didn't like abuse her in any way, she doesn't feel like her expectations weren't met, like meaning like she thought that this was going to be a romantic thing but turned out to be a sexual thing. As long as all those things aren't happening, you don't need to have buyer's remorse, but you still have to be conscious of the fact that her having sex with you, just like sales, is an emotional decision. And there are certain, I guess you can call them sales tactics or game, whatever, that will enable that. But I don't think that necessarily has to increase the level of buyer's remorse. Again, as long as you treat this as like a win-win, and it is legitimately a win for her, and her expectations weren't disappointed. That's what I would say to that.
So here's what I would ask you: would you agree that most sales positions are oftentimes predatory?
No, I don't think so. I wouldn't. Like, in what sense? You mean like salespeople are like predators or something, or?
Well, a lot of time the goal is to kind of utilize people's psychological phenomena, things that all people are susceptible to, at an emotional level especially, to more or less get them towards something that they maybe otherwise wouldn't have said yes to. And oftentimes the whole goal is to sell. And there's a lot of times in these tactics can lead to a lot of buyer's remorse, where people afterwards they get it, they're like, oh man, I don't know why I ever said yes to this. And that way I mean like predatory, like they're very much going in with the goal to like try to get themselves something.
I would have a nuanced answer to that. I think it heavily depends on the product, whether you're selling is something that's actually beneficial or it's something that dog shit. So if you're working for a company that sells a dog shit product that that people don't want, then yeah, I would say there's an element of predatoriness to that. If you're selling a good product that benefits the people, that is something they need, and they're looking for something like that, then no, I don't think it is. Like at my company, for example, we were the second largest residential solar installer. We had I never had any buyer's remorse. I never had a customer who bought solar panels from me and asked for a refund or said they weren't happy. Typically, the vast majority of my customers were happy to give me referrals. And that's actually a big, in sales, you actually don't want people to get buyer's remorse, because then they're not going to recommend you to their friends. And typically, like as an established salesperson, you get most of your sales from referrals. Like referrals are the easiest way to get a sale. Like if their friend says something positive about you, then that person is likely to buy. But you're not going to get that if they have buyer's remorse. So it's in your best interest to make sure there's no buyer's remorse. Unless, of course, you're working for a total scam company, then it's a different story.
Right. So in my view, I think emotional decisions are fine. I think fundamentally, a lot of stuff we buy because we like it. Fundamentally, that's what a lot of it comes down to, right? We buy it because we like it. And I think that that's fine. I also think sales tactics are fine. The issue is that some sales tactics are specifically aimed at reducing agency, like yes momentum, which is a psychological phenomenon where you get people to say yes to small asks, which kind of basically makes it easier to continue saying yes. You basically get them over the threshold of yes with small asks, and it basically somewhat like causes them to not notice when they're continually saying yes. So its whole goal is to reduce their agency, to make them way more likely to say yes. Whereas some sale tactics are no-oriented, and they maximize agency while also increase the likelihood of sale, because a no-oriented question in sales typically maximizes the person's feeling of safety, and therefore they've already gotten past the threshold of saying no, so they feel more comfortable telling you no later on, which means they're actually going to be less like defensive and more understanding, especially if you're going with the approach of, I'm not just trying to get you, I'm genuinely trying to sell you a really good product. No-oriented questions are broadly being viewed, and I don't know if you know this, but like Chris Voss's negotiation techniques are really exploded. Chris Voss's, a lot of his techniques, especially no-oriented questions, are all aimed at maximizing agency, because it turns out that when people feel respected, when they feel like they can trust you because you're actually letting them say yes or no, they're actually more likely to do business with you because people are emotional. And yes momentum, while it might get you the yes, is more likely to cause a person to like feel some level of regret, although they may never say it, because cognitive dissonance is a really powerful thing. But in my view, a more ethical sales practice is going to be no-oriented questions. So in a negotiation of sexual dynamics, I don't mind using tactics necessarily. I mind using tactics that are aimed at reducing agency to get the goal of sex or whatever.
Well, when you say that like a big factor is the quality of the product, meaning in sales, like, is this legitimately a good product or is it a piece of shit? And in dating, like, I guess the version of that would be like, are you like a good guy? Are you going to give her good sex? Are you going to treat her well? Are you going to be a good person to her, right? Like, are you a good product, quote unquote, right? And I think that, and also, is she looking for something similar as you? Like, I think those are two factors. And I think that, like, why would you have buyer's remorse if she's looking for the same thing as you and you're a good product? Meaning, again, you give her good sex, you treat her well, you're respectful, you're nice to her, right? Like, why would you get a buyer's remorse in that situation?
Because if you yes momentumed her, she may afterwards feel like she kind of got conned a little bit, like not fully, not enough maybe to say something, but she might come away just like being like, oh, he just like kind of like boundary pushed and like wiggled his way in, and I didn't really feel safe or valued. And in a sexual relationship, the commodity isn't solar panels. The commodity is somebody else's body. And that actually really, really matters. If somebody feels even a little bit used in an interaction, they basically are going to go forward being more jaded in most future sexual interactions. And the reality is, when you're like dating and sleeping with a lot of women, you're not sending out references, right? A girl isn't gonna be like, hey girls, I slept with this guy, you should sleep with him too, right? That's where like these things don't break down, and like there isn't like this ability to like have the checks and balances of like referencing, because most girls don't reference to their friends of like, oh, I just slept with Alex, he's a good time, you should sleep with him too.
I've had that happen like quite a few times, but yeah, it's not common.
It's not common. They don't ask for a reference list, right? Like most girls wouldn't be like, hey, can I talk to your previous lovers? And let me know if you know where the clit is, like that's not happening in dating dynamics, and probably for good reason. It's weird.
But I would say the check and balance, the natural incentive the guy has not to have buyer's remorse is a false rape charge, or a real rape charge, depending on how far you went. So that's like your thing. Like, I know I would never rape a girl, but I don't want like buyer's remorse and then she claims that I did, right? So that's my incentive, and that's every guy's incentive to like make sure there is no buyer's remorse. So I would say that you have an even stronger incentive, because this is like your freedom, your livelihood, to make sure the girl doesn't get buyer's remorse. It is your best interest, 100%, to make sure she doesn't get buyer's remorse. And the consequences for having buyer's remorse could be very, very dire, i.e. doing 10 years in jail and getting butt raped like every other day. So.
Right. But I'm sure you would agree that you can be a good person, you can be good at sex, you can be a decent dude, and you can also convince somebody who maybe otherwise wouldn't have wanted sex to have sex with you through yes momentum. Just like you can sell a good product and be a good salesman and convince somebody who can't afford it to buy your product.
Right, but that goes to the thing I was saying earlier, looking for the same thing. So if she does not want to have sex, right, you're not looking for the same thing. She's looking for something different, right? That is different versus her looking for sex too, right? But you're just making it as easy as possible for her to be in a place where that can happen.
So maybe we're now saying the same thing. I'm all about basically not trying to convince somebody who, when push to shove, wouldn't really say yes, and basically allowing them to feel safe saying no as much as possible and not utilizing tactics that make it harder to say no. And yes, momentum does make it harder to say no. And it's a very well seen psychological phenomenon. And just so it's clear, it affects men and women. I could yes momentum men as well. Not even just with sex, right? With lots of other things as well.
That would be funny.
And women utilize it, right? And this is a lot of the women that we have a big issue with. They're oftentimes like gold diggers. They're just trying to get them. They're like stealing from men and all sorts of like negative things because they're just trying to get theirs. And that to me is just not the ethic that I want to be approaching dating with.
Yeah, well, that goes back to one thing I was saying earlier, is picking up on social cues and body language. Like if you get good, once you establish, a big part of game is social intuition, really reading the situation. And when you get really good social intuition, you can read a yes or no before it even happens. Meaning like you don't even get rejected when you kiss the girl because you can tell she wasn't really feeling it and you didn't even go for the kiss. That's like the master level. But the level below that, which I think can be fairly decently attained unless you're like autistic or something, in which case that sucks, but is being able to pick up on the social cues that she's giving you, right? And so yeah, like you should be able to tell whether she wants to have sex with you or not, right? You should be able to pick up on whether she's uncomfortable or not. Girls, when the girls are uncomfortable, their body language is pretty like clear. Like they kind of cross their arms, they withdraw, right? And when they're into you, their body language is totally different, and there's everything in between. So you should be able to pick up on those cues, right? But at the same time, like if you are like, let's say you're talking to a girl who really wants to have sex with you, she's interested, but you can be like, hey, do you want to have sex? And she could still say no. She wants to do it, right? But it's just like it wasn't done in a tactful way, or she feels like there's pressure. There's a whole bunch of other factors that women have when it comes to deciding to have sex, which you do have to really help her with. Because if you don't, like, the only kind of girls you're gonna be able to get are the girls who are like very logical, very explicit, very like, hey, I want to get laid tonight, right? Like those are the kind of girls you're gonna be able to get. Most girls are not like that. Most girls are more emotional. They're kind of going with the flow type of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think no-oriented questions still capture these people essentially. Like no-oriented questions can be like pretty cheeky, and they can be very flirty, but it immediately communicates to the person, you can say no to me and it is safe and comfortable. And what you're saying is like, yeah, if somebody's acting the most ethically, that would be the goal of the dating and the sexual negotiation. And I think that that's fine. The issue is like, I think of an example. So my husband is a personal trainer, and I remember he had this situation come up where he had this like middle-aged Islamic woman who really, really wanted to start training. And she was like just about to sign and like book him and like do the whole money exchange and stuff like that. But she had like one hesitation, which was like basically her husband really didn't want her to be in a gym that had men around. And so like, regardless of how you feel as the sales consultant about her relationship, you have two options now. You can utilize a little bit of yes momentum to sell her a product that's good for her. Personal training. My husband's a good personal trainer. He had a really good rapport. He cared about her well-being. You could do that. You could push her and get her over the dotted line. But in this case, he said no. And he said, you know what? I'm not going to, because he was more interested in her well-being. He was concerned that like, yeah, I might be able to convince her into this, but overall it's probably worse for her life. It's probably better if she starts exploring personal training at a women's only gym so that she doesn't have the weird tense dynamic with her husband, but she can still get that, right? And so those are the recommendations made. And in that case, you're maximizing the person's agency, all of this good stuff. And she's still getting the benefit, right? So like the reality is like, if it's in these fuzzy edge cases that I get nervous with the pickup artist communication, because I very rarely hear them talking about ethics. I very rarely hear them talking about like, how do you make no's really easy, right? What are the steps that you utilize to make sure that she feels as comfortable as possible saying no at any time? There's a lot of focus on like, how do you get her to be more and more comfortable with the idea of having sex with you? And if that's your focus, I think you're inherently decreasing her agency, because the whole negotiation on your side is focused on how do I get sex, rather, how do we both be happier by the end of this negotiation? And the reality is, the solution might be neither of you get sex. You're both a little bit bummed because you wanted sex, but maybe it wasn't a really good dynamic, or maybe she's not in the best place. And so I think when you push somebody to say yes, when they would be better off without the product, even if the product's great and you're an ethical person, that's where we get into like this dangerous territory that feels slimy. And I think women are really feeling the effect of that. Like, yeah, I'll stop my monologue.
I mean, I don't necessarily. Okay, so I think let me add a little bit more complexity to this discussion. So I don't think it's like a black and white thing. I think there's a spectrum. Now, there's some things that like 99% of people will be like, yo, that's really fucked up. Like, i.e., having sex with a girl who's blackout drunk, or like saying you have to fuck me in order to get the job, like stuff like that. I think vast majority of people can agree that's like, that's messed up. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where it's like purely like, this is what kind of like the feminist SJWs push, is that like, oh, like you should check consent every way. Like, so you just like, it's like 0.0 chance that like he was even a little bit not feeling it, right? Like you're just like super cautious, right? I do think it's a spectrum. And I do think that you do have to be at least, I don't want to use this word, but I guess I'll say it. You have to be at least a little bit ruthless, but you still like where you draw the line on this ladder does come down to your personal ethics. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think you should ever draw the line at anything that's illegal, right? So if you think there's nothing wrong with like, let's just say like having sex with a drunk girl, like you still should not do it because it's against the law. So you should, of course, like, stay within the legal range, right? But I do think there's a little bit of a limit of where you're going to draw the line. Like, for example, are you going to be comfortable using a yes ladder, right? That's kind of over here, maybe. It's not purely like the most cleanest, let's just say, way of like getting the girl, but it's like not nearly as bad as having sex with a girl who's drunk or putting a lot of external pressure on her, right? So, but the more ruthless you are, the better success you're going to have. And that's just like an unfortunate fact of the game. This is why, like, are you familiar with the term dark triad?
Yes.
Okay, this is why typically dark triad guys have really good success with women, right? They're really, really fucking ruthless. Now, I'm not saying you should be dark triad, right? I do think, again, you have to draw the line. And for me, the line aligns with my ethics, what I think is right or wrong. I don't think there's a universal ladder on that. So if a guy was like, I really don't feel comfortable using a yes letter, I think it's unethical, I'd be like, okay, well, you'll get less girls, but that's up to you. That's your decision. Like, that's where you draw the line. So I do think ethics is somewhat subjective. But the truth is, the more ruthless you are, the more success you will get. I do think, though, the one other thing I will add to this, I do not believe in treating, like, this is what I see feminists and like social justice warriors say. They almost have like this attitude of like women are like these little children who need to be like, who just are incapable of like standing up for themselves. I don't really believe in that. Like, I don't think you should like treat the woman like a little kid. I don't think you should like try to figure out for her like the best decision. Like, no, like you're being honest, you're being upfront, you're showing her what you're all about, right? And it's up to her to make the decision whether she wants to go along with it or not. And that's her choice. You shouldn't try to make that decision for her. Meaning, like, if you have a girl back at your place and she's hitting on you, she's into, but you find out that she has that she has a boyfriend or whatever, and you're like, it's in her best interest if she doesn't have sex with me. Like, I would never go that far. I'd be like, let her decide. It's her choice whether she wants to fuck you or not. So that'd be kind of where I stand on that. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
I guess I would ask you, what is your hesitancy? And maybe there isn't. Is there a hesitancy on your part with replacing yes momentum with no oriented questions?
What would be like a no oriented question would be like, hey, are you, if you're uncomfortable going home with me, just tell me now or something? Like, would that
No, it would be more like, would you be against going on a walk? And most girls would be like, no, not at all. It's really simple. It's really subtle, but it immediately makes her more comfortable to say no.
I'll be honest. I've never tried no-oriented questions.
Give it a try. I'm curious to know how it impacts. Chris Voss swears by it.
Yeah, although to be fair, like, I'm a big fan of Chris Voss, but he's like an FBI negotiator, and like his whole thing is a little different, but there's probably some overlap. Yes. The closest I have is like takeaways, which I will do will be like, if the girl's not responding, I'll be like, if you're not interested, just let me know and I can stop trying. So I'll do takeaways, but that's not really the same thing. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any like ethical issue with it or something like that. If it works, it works. It would just like, if I notice that, like, if I use no oriented questions and my success rate like significantly like, plunged, then, well, I probably would not use them. But it just comes down to like, what is the, like, if the efficacy is close to the same, then yeah, I don't see anything wrong with it. If the efficacy like, plummets, then that's a different story.
What if you get 10% less sex, but every woman you have sex with feels 50% more comfortable with the sex and happier about it?
Oh man, there's like no way you can know that statistic, right? It's not like you can't be like.
It's a hypothetical. I'm not saying that is the statistic. How would you feel about it then?
I would probably, if it was only 10% less and the girl feels 50% more comfortable, I'd probably adopt it. But then there's some confounding factors. I have a girlfriend, so I'm not like, well, just to be clear, I'm not like cheating on her.
Well, you could give it with your clients instead. I'd be curious to know. You don't have to, obviously, but
it really depends on their goal. like if their goal is to have as much sex as possible and they're like, maybe they're like incels or they're shy, they're virgins, then probably not, because I think that 10% can be a make it or break it for them. But if they're guys who are already like, pretty successful and, they're just looking to improve a little bit, then yeah, that probably yes. So yeah, it would just depend on the client and their needs and wants and whatever.
Yeah. And so this is the main thing with pickup artists, is that there's a really big focus on what the men want out of the exchange and not a lot of consideration for like best practice with women. And I think this is what leads to women feeling like commodities. And you don't want to be communicating to a large body of people to turn another person into a commodity, right? Yes, momentum inherently goes, I want to get mine, right? You said you got to be a little bit more ruthless to get more success. And it's like, well, what if you had a little bit less success, but everyone felt better around you, and the women who you interacted with became way less jaded or scared of sexual relationships? Because it really feels like we're in this dynamic where women are gatekeeping even more than ever, and even doing things like shit testing and stuff. And like, in clearness, I've debated lots of women about dating, and they have a lot of really bad advice for women, right? Like shit testing and doing similarly really slimy shit to men. Doing things like saying no, but kind of meaning yes, and like being like, and shaming men for not taking the lead. All these things are really toxic that women contribute to the dating space. But for men, if your whole focus is, how do I get mine? You're not entering the negotiation as a good negotiation partner.
Yeah. So the shit testing thing, I think, is like super duper common. And I don't even necessarily consider it negative. If the girl does it too much, that would be a negative. But a little bit of shit testing, I think, is just like standard for women. And I think there's a reason why women shit test. It's basically a better way of calling it is a congruence test. If the guy's acting like he's this cool, high value guy, is he actually that guy? I'm going to give him the shit test. If he like folds, or if he like, like makes a big scene, or he gets butthurt, then he's not the guy that he presents himself to be. So I understand the logic for women to shit test. You would hope that once you get into a relationship, it stops at a certain point, right? But yeah.
Problem is, it's a lie. It's a lie. A lot of women will shit test on boundaries that they don't care about, just to know if you can take an L. And right. I think that's really slimy. Especially, there's a lot of autistic men that are trying to date. Shit testing really fucks with them. They're like, wait, you said no to that, and now you're telling me to literally do that, and I don't know what you want. And so it leads a lot of men, I think, really, really spurned with women. And then similarly, I think a lot of men that approach like, how do I get mine, and like using like slimy, like yes momentum tactics, leave a lot of women burned as well. And I want to see both groups burning each other less. That would be my recommendation.
Here, I think, is what the difference between you and I in terms of our mindsets. I think you're a little bit more idealistic versus I'm a little bit more pragmatic. So I agree with that. It would be better if women didn't shit test. Like, yeah, for sure. If I could like click a button, women will never shit test again, I would click that button. The problem is that I don't have that choice, and women shit test all the time.
How would you feel if I was a dating coach for women and I told them to shit test?
Well, I would say
it works.
I would say, well, no, I wouldn't say it works. Like, works in what way? Like, what is your goal as a woman?
Keeps you safe. It makes you feel like, okay, he's comfortable when I say no. I feel safer saying no. It's essentially getting their no-oriented question on their own in not a super great way. So how would you feel if I told women shit test men?
If it comes down to a safety thing, I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Interesting. I guess that's where we're different. I wouldn't be comfortable. I'm not comfortable with pickup artists telling men to basically yes momentum, and I'm not comfortable telling women to shit test. I think both of them essentially somewhat treat the other person not as a human, and that's where a lot of our negotiation and sexual interactions fall apart. Is that the full goal on both sides is like very self-focused, and it's very strange, and then we get a lot of these weird dating dynamics that I don't like, and I don't think it leads to good relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, just to clarify, I don't think you're like, I think the pragmatic idealistic thing is like a ladder. So I'm not saying you're 100% idealistic. I think you're like somewhat pragmatic. I would say that I'm probably more pragmatic on this topic, just kind of in my observation. And so I agree with you in theory. Like, sure, it would be nice if none of that happened. Like, in theory, I agree with you. It's just like, it does happen. It is what it is. And I don't have a magic wand where I can change the world. So my goal is to help my subscribers achieve the kind of sex and dating life that they want, while, of course, not crossing what I would consider my ethics, right? So, for example, like, yeah, you can get more results if you like get girls wasted, but I wouldn't tell subscribers to do that. So, yeah, that's kind of where I think you and I would differ.
Yeah, the main thing is I'm like, what if you can switch it for something that increases agency and doesn't seem to impact efficacy? Because if you're like, well, he's an FBI negotiator. If his whole goal in FBI negotiation with terrorists is to maximize their agency and he has an exceedingly high success rate, women aren't terrorists. They're way much more like human and like, I shouldn't say human, but like it's a much more human interaction that you're having. You're way less at odds, right? If you're negotiating with a terrorist, you're inherently like starting out in a fight. Whereas most sexual relationships, you're starting out like ideally with like both want to see each other, which is nice. So if no-oriented questions work in that situation and maximize agency, and oftentimes end with the terrorist feeling more warm and more like comfortable with the negotiator, why wouldn't it work in dating relationships? Why wouldn't it both all likely increase some likelihood of getting sex, other than a few situations? I can't imagine it ever harming sex, actually, and really makes her feel more comfortable.
Yeah, so if it was a situation where it does not decrease efficacy but increases agency, I would be all for it. Why not? Like, you have nothing to lose. I typically try not to comment on things I haven't personally tried, so I don't want to say it's not going to work or it is going to work because I don't know. I haven't tried no into questions. So yeah, if it like was the same effect, but let's just assume for argument's sake that it decreased efficacy, right? Then the question is how much. What if it significantly decreases efficacy? Would I be in favor of it then? No, probably not. Not in that situation.
Why do you think it would decrease efficacy? Why do you think saying like, hey, would you be against going on a walk? Would you be against going to this local pub I found? It's super cool. Would you be, why do you think that would lead to lower results?
By the way, just to be clear, I'm not claiming it would reduce efficacy because I don't know. I haven't tried it yet. But how I could perceive reducing efficacy, would you be against going to my place? Because the girl at that point, if she's like, I think the way I could see it working is if the girl is like I think it could put her in a more logical position where she starts thinking logically, like, oh, like you can kind of take her out of that like nice emotional flow state that she's in, which is like, where she should be in when she's talking to you, where she's just going with her feelings, intuition, and take her into a more logical state. And she starts thinking, would I really be against that? Well, like logically, it's scary to go home with a guy. So yeah, I guess I would be against that, right? Versus if you're just like taking the lead and making it happen, you keep her out of that logical headspace and more emotional headspace. And like, that may sound like a little like creepy, right? From a girl's perspective, sure. But as a guy, that you're not going to like do anything bad to her, right? So you're not worried. Like, I'm not worried about my tactics on a girl because I know I'm not going to do anything bad to her, in the first place. I can see how she would be worried, right? But I'm just saying, so that's the one way I could see it like kind of hurting efficacy potentially, or maybe not.
Yeah. And so I guess that's my concern, is the concern of efficacy is like, well, she might actually think about the fact that she might not want to. And I'm like, we want women to think about that. We want men to think about that. If they don't want to, they don't want your product. But why would you try to convince them to have your product? Like if she's if you're like, hey, would you be against coming back to my place, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I'm not sure. Why would you want to convince her to come back and have sex with you if she's hesitant?
Well, she might want to have sex with you, but it could be a safety thing. So like as a woman, like it's probably like, if you think about logically, going back to a random guy's place that you've known for half an hour is probably not the smartest thing to do. Like logically, it doesn't really make sense, right? From her perspective, because she doesn't know that you're not a serial killer, but you're not a serial killer. So logically, like she might want to fuck you, but it's a safety thing, or she might not want to get judged by her friends who are at the bar too. So there could be plenty of logical reasons that she may want to have sex with you, but she would still not go home with you.
Do you think if she didn't go home with you, she'd be more open to a second date? Because why do you have to have sex on the first date? What if you can take her out twice and then have sex? And you both enjoy it more, and it's better sex because you guys know each other better.
Yeah, so in principle, I have like absolutely nothing against that. I have no problem with going like 2 dates with a girl, even 3 dates with a girl before having sex. Like I have no issue with it. Idealistically, problem is pragmatically, it seldom works out that way. Like quite often, and this happens to every guy, me, all my clients, everyone is you may have a good interaction, you may get the girl's number, she still flakes for any number of reasons, or another guy winds up taking her home 20 minutes after you, right? So, and then she gets laid, and then you basically, you miss out, right? So yes, in theory, there's nothing wrong with that, but quite often doesn't work out that way. So if you like a girl, I always say this, if you like a girl, you want to date her, you want to be in a relationship with her, one of the best things you could do is sleep with her as soon as possible without making her feel pressured or have buyer's remorse.
Okay. Why would you say that it's better to sleep with her as soon as possible if you want a long-term relationship?
Because sex is the ultimate form of investment for a girl.
So it's the yes momentum as well? Like if she says yes to sex, she's probably going to say yes to dating?
Once a girl has sex with a guy, typically, unless she's like super casual sex oriented, she's going to be invested in that guy. Unless, of course, you do something bad, you like treat her bad or something like that. Assuming everything is like on the up and up, she's going to be very invested. Versus, she's going to be significantly less invested with a guy that she just went on a date on. And a lot of girls, especially nowadays, they're not just like talking to you; they have several options, right? Assuming they're not in a relationship. Let's take my girlfriend for example. Right, like she's not a promiscuous girl. Like she's like definitely on the lower tier of that, but she's not like a religious virgin either. And so when we met, like I wasn't the only guy she was talking to. She was talking to multiple guys, right? I don't blame her for that. She's a cute girl. She didn't know me at all at that point, right? So the other guy, like, yeah, like if she has sex with me and she doesn't have sex with the other guy, but she likes us equally, she's probably going to go with me because she's a lot more invested in me in that point.
But isn't that because women are very gatekeepy? So if they're more likely to have sex with you, it's probably because they actually like you more overall.
She could like me equally. She could like the other guy more, but one of us made sex happen while the other one didn't. Typically, women will not initiate or take the lead on sex unless they're like really, let's just say like sexual, casual oriented. And even then, not always. So for example, let's just do like a hypothetical. I'm at a bar, right? I meet my future girlfriend there, right? I talk to her for 20 minutes. I get her number. Another guy talks to her for 20 minutes and gets her number, right? She finds us both equally attractive. She likes both of our personalities the same, right? And all other factors equal. But the other guy winds up taking her home and having sex with her because he makes it happen versus I just like sit there and talk to her and just get her number. That guy has such a better chance of getting a relationship with her than me if all other factors are equal. Now, look, it can happen. Like if you go to the other extreme, maybe she likes me so much more than the other guy that she has sex with that she still goes back to me. But assuming she likes us both the same, she's going to go with a guy that she has sex with like 9 out of 10 times.
Do you think the grounds for a healthy relationship is using like some sort of like psychological phenomenon against somebody to convince them more to buy into you? Like, is that good grounds for a relationship?
I don't see it as problematic. I think you have to acknowledge the fact that people in general, not just women, are emotional beings. And certain psychological things work. It just kind of is what it is. It might be better if we lived in a world where they didn't work or people didn't do that, but they do work. So I don't see like it lowering your relationship success rate if you like hook up with a girl on the first night with the idea that you know that if you have sex with her on the first night, that she's more likely to date you, unless, of course, like I said, there's some kind of buyer's remorse or pressure involved.
Right. And so in this relationship, right, if your zeitgeist is to some extent in interpersonal interactions, there are certain psychological phenomena that I could use to make it more likely to go my way, even if the person isn't very likely to want to go my way. That to me feels like really dangerous interpersonal strategy for negotiating relationship. And in this case, now you've got potentially in this situation, you can get buyer's remorse where you get a really, really, really messy breakup where both people at this point are super spurned. And it feels like you're approaching, it's still approaching the negotiation from how do I get mine more and how do I convince them and like tip them over the edge using psychological like tricks essentially.
Yeah, I see it again. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. I see it as a win-win. So I don't see this as like me getting something from the girl, me getting sex from the girl. I see it as a win-win. We both get to have an awesome experience together. However, it is still up to me to make that experience happen. I have to be the one, even though this is going to benefit both of us, right? I still have to be the one that initiates, take the lead of that. And that's just because that's the way dating in the world works. And like, that's just, it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't know then maybe if we'll ever agree on this, because in general, I think this principle is leading not wholly, but in a lot of ways to people being less good of a partner. I think a good partner doesn't try to premeditatively think about ways that they can make their partner more likely to do what they want, because that's inherently somewhat manipulative. And I think naive people will be tricked by that. I believe you that it works. The problem is just because it works doesn't mean that it makes you a better person or the world a better place. And I think in general, I'm very big on advocating for best practice and trying to like leave things at least neutral, but as much as possible, not as worse as possible. And what you're talking about, it could leave it neutral, but there's a decent risk as well for it being really negative for somebody. Whereas like a no-oriented approach or like maximizing agency approach, to my view, does lead to like, it could be neutral. You might get rejected, but it's probably going to be a smaller rejection and a lot more opportunity for the positivity.
Yeah, I think as a man, you have to ask yourself this question: do you want to leave the world a better place, or do you want to win? Right. And again, they don't necessarily have to be at odds with each other. You can have both. Right. But if you're it is like a ladder, right? So you don't want to be like too far. Like you don't want to be just, I'm going to get mine no matter what. Yeah, that's not like a healthy mindset. I would agree that's toxic. But if you're all the way on the other extreme and you're just like, how can I do what's best for the world? How can I do what's best for the girl? You're going to be a loser and you're like really not going to get what you want. Now, I do think women do have more luxury with that. As a woman, you can be very, what's the term? Idealistic and still be a great partner, right? I think as a man, you by default, if you want to succeed in the super competitive marketplace, you have to be a little bit more pragmatic than that. And you have to lean a little bit more on the side of the equation. Again, that's not to say that you should like fuck girls over or just do get yours at all extent or lie to women or trick women. I'm not arguing for any of that. But
to some extent we are, right? We want to trick women a little bit as far as like yes momentum. So like women feel less comfortable with saying no. They've said yes. We're willing to use like that psychological phenomenon against them to like make it more likely that like we can win. And it's like a winning in a negotiation is both parties coming away decently happy. And I think that happens by like being considerate of both sides, not how do I win? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I would say it's like a spectrum, right? So yes, I like a little bit of like, I guess we can call it like, I hate using the word trickery. Let's just use the word manipulation. Like a little bit, I think can be acceptable. I think again, it comes down to your ethics, right? But there's a reason why I do think you can have like a nice happy balance where in between where you are using some like very like surface level basic like game or manipulation, what do you want to call it, right? But you're still not getting like buyer's remorse or you're still not like, skeeving out women, right? And I think a lot of that also goes into like whether like what this is stuff I've been saying, like one, whether the girl's looking for something similar as you, and two, like let's say let's do an example. Let's say the girl, you pick up on the fact that one, the girl at a bar is attracted to you, two, that she's like more into casual, like sex, right? You pick up on that fact, right? That still doesn't mean she wants to go home with you. I mean, that still doesn't mean that she's feels safe going home with you, right? She doesn't know you. She doesn't know if you're a serial killer or not, which is totally valid. So if you make it like a very like logical decision at the bar, you're like, hey, do you want to go back to my place? She might say no simply because she's worried about her safety, right? But if you're a good person and you're not going to hurt her, you're not going to fuck her over, she's looking for the same thing as you, you could use some like basic manipulation to get her back at your place, like not do anything bad to her and still come away with a situation where she feels happy and she feels satisfied and she feels like it was a good experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. You definitely could. And I'm not saying that you couldn't. I'm not even saying that in most times you could. I'm saying in the fringe cases where that's not happening, or if you have somebody listening to you that is fundamentally more self-focused, they essentially say, could I make the world a better place or can I win? And they say, winning is always number one. That to me feels like something I would just never want to be advocating for the world. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even know if I believe that that's really like what you would advocate for the world, because you seem like really reasonable, balanced and stuff like that. Like, I don't think you really think what's most important is like winning. I imagine what you're most concerned with is I want to make sure that both parties are happy. That's what I'm hearing. And I'm saying, how do we do that in a way that maximizes both parties' agency as much as possible?
Yeah. So I think, I appreciate that. But I think like if we look at it in terms of a scale, because it is a scale, well, I'm just trying to get my hands in the camera. Like you might be like, I don't think you're purely idealistic. Like I think that, but you are much more on the how do we make a world a better place? Like I want to be like super ethical versus I'm definitely not on like the other extreme of the spectrum where I'm like, yo, I just want to get mine. But I'm probably further along on that than you are. Maybe by 20%, maybe by 40%. But yeah, like a bit more. But yeah, I do think you can go way too far where just become a narcissist and like a shitty human being. And then you can get also, but I do think you have it as a man, you have an inherent self-interest to not have girls get buyer's remorse because, of the, potential allegation thing. So yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Maybe, but I think young men and women are not very good at knowing how to navigate that well. And I think in a lot of hookup culture on both genders' sides, there's this fixation on how do I get mine? And I don't think negotiation where both parties are exclusively focused on like selfish gain and winning leads to super good outcomes for either party. And that makes me really sad, essentially. I don't actually think I'm super idealistic at all. I would say like a lot of what I talk about is quite pragmatic. I'm not opposed to certain things, but for example, I don't know how you'd feel about this, but there's a lot of manipulative tactics that women can also utilize to like get as much money and get as much like goods out of a man and giving very little back. And I think that that is similarly really destructive because you leave the man more jaded, and the woman gets away with being a shitty person. And jaded men, we have enough of them in this world. We don't need to make more. Just like we don't need to be making more women who are scared of sex, scared of men, and have really negative interactions. And so I think, because I'm not saying don't be a pickup artist. I'm not saying don't use some level of sales tactics. I'm saying use sales tactics that maximize agency for both parties. I think your advocacy is going to be quite highly similar. There might be some who say no, but the ones who say no should be saying no from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah. I think we're just like a little bit different on the scale, but I don't think we're like complete opposite ends of the spectrum.
No,
basically.
no.
Definitely not.
Do you have 2 seconds for me to use the washroom super quick?
Yeah, sure.
I ran here from the gym, so I haven't really gotten a chance.
Yeah, go for it. Yep. What's up, babe?
What's up, babes?
Are we? You want to go to Graziano's? I told Edward. I think we'll make it. You got home early.
Yeah.
Let's tell the guys how I tricked you into dating me.
Let them call me.
But yeah, no, I was just gonna wrap up like right now, and then yeah, no, we'll I think we'll be okay.
It's calling me a solid 6.65.
Oh, you're hiding your best assets, like.
Is he kidding me? What?
We gotta move the chair a little bit.
We're not done. You're a jerk. No, well, 6.6 and 6.65. I'll take it. It's not an insult.
Yeah.
It's not an insult.
No. But yeah, this has been an interesting discussion. Hey, I do gotta dip in like a second because we have like a dinner reservation. But I think we should definitely do a part 2. I think there's a lot more we could discuss.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being like super good faith. A lot of people, when you try to like talk about these dynamics, they're like terrible faith. But I watched you with Daphne and a couple of other conversations. I was like, this guy's super good faith. So
yeah, no, thanks. Nice. I definitely appreciate it about you. I mean, I definitely agree with your assessment that Fresh and Fit is like very bad faith, which is what I've been saying for a while.
I do have a goal to get on there with Destiny, so look forward to that. It'll be a fun time.
Yeah, let me have the chat help. We have a lot of overlap in our fans. God only knows why. Yo, guys, if do you help her get on Fresh and Fit? I would love to see that debate. I think that would be fascinating. I do think it's low probability because you're like.
I'm small, but but Destiny's big. So I think they might like the clout exchange. And I'm decently cute, and I'll wear some cuter outfits.
No, I know, but I think like they don't like they're like the Jake Paul of like whatever debates. They're not even debaters. Is they pick their opponents very carefully, and that means like a drunk 18-year-old girl, like a more articulate, sober girl. That's not like because they know that they will lose that fight. Like I think deep down inside, those guys know that they're like not that good at arguing or presenting, and that they have like a lot of like whatever shortcomings. So, but I would love to see that happen. So,
sure. Can I make a challenge to you between now and then? I'm curious to see your experience. Can you just do no oriented questions with your girlfriend, just for like light things, like rather than saying, "Do you want to go here?" Say, "Would you be against going here?" And just see her reaction. I'm just curious. I just want to know how you feel about it and what your experiences with it, and then maybe we can talk about it again. You can be like, "This is the worst thing ever," and that's fair. But I'm super curious.
Yeah, I could try that. Although I think to get better data, I would have to try this with new girls. I feel like me and my girlfriend basically like we were all into the same shit. Like I don't think she would say no to me either way, more often than not. But yeah, I'll try it a little bit. Sure, why not?
Sure, just with your girlfriend. Like I'm not asking you to like start dating other women or anything. Just see if she has a different reaction to you. I'm curious. I'm curious just to know how it even is between you and your girlfriend.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally. But yeah, like thank you again so much for coming on. I think we'll definitely set up a part 2.
Sure.
I thought it was a good discussion.
Do you want me to email you, or do you want to email me for timings?
Either or. I'll shoot me an email. I'll shoot you an email. Yeah, feel free to shoot me an email.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll coordinate that way. But yeah,
Awesome.
cool, awesome guys. All right, so check out Erudude's channel. Up on that.
Erudite, yeah. My chat always laughs when people can't say my name, which no one can, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, no, check out. She has some good stuff. I was watching her channel today. It's definitely, she's very, like, I would say you're very like balanced and reasonable in your views. You're not like an ideologue or whatever, virtue signaler. So yeah, I enjoyed what I watched. So yeah, I encourage my subscribers to check it out too.
Yeah, vice versa. I'll make sure to put all your socials and enjoy. I don't know what restaurant. I heard you say Regala or something like that.
Yeah, it's my favorite steakhouse in Miami. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Well, enjoy that. Oh, you're in Miami as well, hey?
Yeah, I know. I live right down the street from Fresh and Fit, but yeah.
No way.
We don't really like each other.
No, that's crazy. Well, maybe if I come down to Miami, we can do like a live podcast or something.
Yeah, for sure.
Too.
100%. Cool. Yeah. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay, have a good night.